Hello, and thank you for listening to the 147th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. So this is a special episode about Puerto Rico, an island about the size of Connecticut that's located around 1,000 miles off the coast of Florida. And this episode really started last summer when I produced the Congressional Dish episode number 128 called Crisis in Puerto Rico. And if you haven't heard it, I do suggest you press stop right now. You go back and listen to that episode because that's really going to give you a lot of the background on some of the history and actually it's not even history, the current events that are happening right now in Puerto Rico. Again, that's Congressional Dish episode 128. Please listen to it. But in that episode, I read and highlighted the Puerto Rican Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act, which is more commonly referred to as PROMESA. As a result of PROMESA becoming law, 7 people picked by the U.S. Congress and President Obama were appointed to a Fiscal Control Board to make monetary policy on the island of Puerto Rico. The Fiscal Control Board is able to change and or waive Puerto Rican laws and regulations. The Fiscal Control Board can cut services the government performs for the Puerto Rican people. The governor of Puerto Rico does not have a vote on the board. In fact, no Puerto Ricans do. And the board is paid for with Puerto Rico's money. And so naturally, my reaction to finding this out was, what the f***? Because as a Californian who has lived in Colorado, Hawaii, Massachusetts, Oregon, states all over the country, I know that I would be livid if this was done by Congress to my state. States' rights and all. But is Puerto Rico a state? Turns out, no, it's a territory. And so how does Congress have the ability to put a board in charge of the island like this? After reading that law for the first time in my life, I wondered, what exactly is our relationship to Puerto Rico? Because if I'm going to be honest here, I never thought of Puerto Rico at all before having this law land on my desk. You know, I guess I knew that we had territories. I mean, I knew that states were all territories before they became states, but I never really thought about that. And I definitely never considered the fact that we still have territories that are in this limbo between being independent and being states. And so I guess PROMESA was my got woke moment on the idea of territories. And ever since, I felt like this is something I should know. And although this podcast has listeners in 182 countries, I checked that, isn't that cool? But we have listeners in 182 countries, but this is a show that's really for American voters because that's the only country that I can change, the United States, because that's the only country where I'm a citizen. And this episode is directed at American citizens more than most. Even though everyone in the world is welcome to listen in on our American conversation, I'm happy to have you. But this is an American-centric podcast and a very American voter-centered episode because my citizenship is where my power is. And to be a cheesy Pollyanna about it, if I want to make the world a better place, my American citizen power is my best tool. And now my power on a national level is in Congress because that's where my representation is. And I pick my representatives. I direct my power using my vote. Which is why I'm disturbed to discover that we have American citizens who don't have votes. Because it turns out that people in Puerto Rico are American citizens. They have been American citizens for exactly 100 years this month. But even though they've been citizens for a century, Puerto Ricans don't get to vote for president and their representative in Congress. Well, their representative isn't a representative, it's a resident commissioner. And they're not a representative, doesn't have a real vote either. And I'm sorry, but here in the USA, citizens get votes, damn it. And don't give me any bullshit about, well, the founders, Jennifer, they said the territories are blah, 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 blah. Shut up. In the mythology taught to me in school, citizens get votes. That's basic. And as an adult, now learning about our often shameful reality, if there are citizens who don't get votes in this country, they fucking should. Which brings me to why I had to go and see Puerto Rico. Because Puerto Ricans are American citizens. They pay taxes and they fight in our wars and they don't get votes. And that goes for people from the Virgin Islands, Guam, and the Northern Mariana Islands too, but those are territorial rabbit holes for another day. Puerto Rico is the one that landed on my desk last June because our Congress created a fiscal control board to rule their financials. And so even though the other territories are eligible for their own financial dictator boards because of PROMESA, and you guys should know that this bill wasn't only for Puerto Rico. The minute the other territories get in debt too, they can get a fiscal control board of your own. So keep that in mind. But it was Puerto Rico that is the first to actually get one. And therefore today we're going to focus on that amazing island and what is going on there. So to make this episode happen, I did a few things. First, before I left on March 7th, I conducted an over-the-phone interview with Luis Balzac. Luis is the former Undersecretary of State in the Puerto Rican State Department. He's also worked in the pharmaceutical industry in Puerto Rico, which if you listen to episode number 128, you'll remember that was a big industry in Puerto Rico for a while and actually still is. And then Luis also currently works as a consultant to businesses that operate in Puerto Rico. And so I was intrigued by the opportunity to speak to him because he has worked in the government in Puerto Rico on a high level. He also worked in the private sector and for the nonprofit sector on the island. And so that's why I wanted to speak to him. But then I also trust him because he was recommended to me by a friend of the podcast, by Dave, who made the connection. And so first of all, thank you, Luis, for agreeing to talk to me and for such an enlightening conversation. And then Dave, thank you for making this interview happen. In this episode, you're going to hear portions of that interview. I also read a mind-blowing book called War Against All Puerto Ricans, Revolution and Terror in America's Colony by Nelson Dennis. And I relied heavily upon that book for the historical story I'm going to tell you today. However, I've got to tell you that when I was reading this book, I didn't believe a lot of what I read. And so I fact-checked this stuff, which, the author, Nelson Dennis, made easy because a good quarter of the book is sources. So that was nice. In this episode's show notes, you're going to find links to not only the book, but also to articles and documents, FBI files, so much information. And unfortunately, it appears that what I discovered in Puerto Rico is all true. And then another way that I fact-checked this information was by taking a 6-day workcation to Puerto Rico with one of my best friends, Ryan Delisle. In this episode, you'll also hear bits of our conversation that we recorded while driving around the island, hunting down the locations of the events that I read about, and observing what life is like on the island. We did not stay on the interstate. We went off the beaten path, and we had a few adventures. Ryan, you're a great sport and an amazing friend. Thank you so much for coming on this trip with me. Now, I know that at least a few of you are probably thinking right now, I don't care about Puerto Rico, get back to the bills. But even if you're thinking that, I really hope you keep listening to this episode because this story is so much bigger than Puerto Rico. Through Puerto Rico, I saw our past, our real past, not the happy myths. But I also saw our present because what's happening in Puerto Rico is happening to us all. And then I think I saw our future. And I'm afraid I saw my future, which is a preventable future, but one that's been, honestly, it's been haunting me, like having trouble sleeping kind of haunting me. Puerto Rico hit me deep. And so let me tell you why. So first, the basics. Like I said before, Puerto Rico is an island. It's about 1,000 miles off the coast of Florida, and it has about 3.5 million residents, although that number is quickly declining because the island is seeing a massive population exodus. There have been about 500,000 people who have left the island in the last few years. Now, like I said before, the island of Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory, and it has been clearly established as recently as last year via the Supreme Court that federal law trumps the island's constitution. And so even though the island of Puerto Rico has its own government, which is structured a lot like the U.S. federal government, Congress can amend or discard any laws that the Puerto Ricans make. Also, like I said before, Puerto Rican residents are American citizens who don't get to vote for president. They have no representation in the Senate at all, and in Congress, they elect one non-voting member. Although when I call their member non-voting, there is a technicality that is worth talking about. So here's a portion of my conversation with Luis Balzac. In this clip, he refers to Pedro Pierluisi, who was Puerto Rico's non-voting member of Congress at the time I recorded the Crisis in Puerto Rico episode, which he listened to. And so that's why he's calling me out on saying that Pedro Pierluisi didn't have a vote.
And there's a slight correction to what you said about Pierluisi in your podcast. The resident commissioner does have a vote in Congress, not on committees, on subcommittees. Okay,
so he has a vote on a subcommittee, but not in the committee or the main house.
Correct. Now, you ready for the kicker?
Yes.
If the vote on a subcommittee comes to a point where the resident commissioner becomes the deciding vote, it doesn't go. You got to vote again.
No.
Yeah.
So that's kind of not really having a vote. I mean, he does.
No, I know.
So for all intents and purposes, the resident commissioner doesn't really have a vote. But how did we get here? Well, for at least the past few generations, Puerto Rico has been controlled by some other country. Before the United States took over Puerto Rico, it belonged to Spain. And at one point, it seemed as though Puerto Rico might be granted independence. In 1897, during the Spanish-American War, the Spanish Prime Minister signed the Charter of Autonomy, which granted Puerto Rico the right to its own legislature, constitution, tax policy, monetary system, treasury, judiciary, and international borders. Elections for the new legislature were held in March of 1898, and the new government was scheduled for installation in May of 1898. Well, on May 12th, 1898, 12 U.S. battleships, destroyers, and torpedo boats bombed the city of San Juan, which is the capital of Puerto Rico, for 3 straight hours. The United States took the newly independent island by force. Shortly after the U.S. invasion, one of the largest hurricanes in Caribbean history hit Puerto Rico and destroyed thousands of Puerto Rican farms and nearly the entire 1898 coffee bean crop, which devastated the island's economy. And so what did the United States do? Did rich people throw charity balls and shower our new island with rebuilding funds? No, the United States sent no money. Instead, the following year, the United States outlawed all Puerto Rican currency and declared the island's peso, which at the time was equal to the US dollar, well, we declared the peso to be worth only 60 American cents. And so every Puerto Rican lost 40% of his or her savings overnight. 2 years later, the bankers moved in. In 1901, a colonial land tax known as the Hollander Bill forced many small farmers to mortgage their land with U.S. banks. With no laws regulating the banks on the island, interest rates were set so high that within a decade, the farmers defaulted on their loans, the banks foreclosed, and took their properties. Now, this is a move that, had we known Puerto Rico's history with our bankers, could have foreshadowed how the bankers would play quote-unquote homeowners in this most recent decade. Because here's a reality that very few people like to acknowledge when they buy a home. You don't own that home until you have paid off every cent you borrowed from the bank. If you can't pay your loan, the bank can and will take your house, which means you don't really own it. The bank does. The genius bankers in the run-up to the financial crash were screwing with people's mortgages, and one of the trickiest moves was to offer people adjustable rate loans. The way these worked is that people went to the bank to get a loan for a house, and they saw their monthly payments at first were amazingly low. They could afford it. But in the fine print that people didn't read or understand, after a few months or years, the bank would jack up the interest rate so high that people couldn't afford their monthly payments anymore, just like they did to the landowners in Puerto Rico. And then the banks took people's homes. Those same banks and investors gobbled up properties and converted them to rentals, now ensuring that banks get to profit from our housing whether we rent or buy. But back to Puerto Rico. After the U.S. forced landowners to take out loans on their own land from the banks, who then stole the properties via high interest rates, the U.S. banking interests dedicated 45% of all farmable land in Puerto Rico to just one crop, sugar. And there was one person in particular who was largely responsible for this happening. The very first governor who was appointed by the U.S. president to run Puerto Rico, Charles Herbert Allen. He used his brief time in office to create a sugar empire all for himself. First, Charles Herbert Allen created a budget for the entire island. He raised property taxes, withheld loans from Puerto Rican farmers, and froze all building repair and school construction funds. He then redirected this money to subsidize U.S.-owned farms on the islands. He issued contracts to his favored U.S. businessmen with no competition at all, and then directed roads to be built by agents from his father's Massachusetts lumber business at double the cost. As for the Puerto Ricans, their new role in their country would be labor, cheap labor, for the U.S.-owned sugar companies. In Governor Allen's first annual report to U.S. President William McKinley, he wrote, quote, "With American capital and American energies, the labor of the natives can be utilized to the lasting benefit of all parties," unquote. A few weeks after turning in this report, on September 15, 1901, Allen resigned as governor. He then headed straight to Wall Street, where he became a high-ranking official in J.P. Morgan's banking empire. He also quickly installed himself as treasurer and then president of the largest sugar refining company in the world, the American Sugar Refining Company, which is now known as Domino Sugar. You can find their product on a shelf near you. From his new position, ex-Governor Charles Herbert Allen turned the company into the largest sugar company in the world, based off of the labor of the Puerto Rican people. He pulled this off with the help of the people he had appointed to government in Puerto Rico, who provided him with land grants, tax subsidies, water rights, railroad easements, foreclosure sales, and favorable tax policies. Our relationship with Puerto Rico got off to a very corporatist start. In the middle of Puerto Rico's transition into a giant sugar plantation, the U.S. Congress passed the Jones Shaffroth Act, which authorized a Puerto Rican Bill of Rights in Congress, an elected resident commissioner to the United States Congress, and immediate U.S. citizenship for all Puerto Ricans. Which sounds nice and all, except for the fact that this law had some flaws. First of all, the U.S. Congress could ignore any Puerto Rican Bill of Rights. Second, the U.S. Congress could override any laws passed by the Puerto Rican Congress. Third, the resident commissioner had no vote in the U.S. Congress. And fourth, U.S. citizenship was a vehicle for drafting Puerto Rican men into the U.S. military to fight in World War I. We know this because exactly 1 month after the passage of the Jones Shaffroth Act, President Woodrow Wilson presented his declaration of war against Germany before the U.S. Congress. Then on June 27, 1917, Wilson ordered the registration and recruitment of the male inhabitants of Puerto Rico between the ages of 21 and 31. 20,000 Puerto Ricans were drafted and fought for the United States in World War I. 100 years later, they still can't vote for their own commander-in-chief. So obviously that's unfair, but the law that has been financially f***ing Puerto Rico the longest and the hardest is the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, also known as the Jones Act. Because of this law, all goods, all of them, carried by boat to the island between U.S. ports must be on ships that are owned by U.S. companies and that are constructed in the United States. So they have to be owned by U.S. citizens and operated by U.S. citizens. Every product that enters or leaves Puerto Rico must be carried on a U.S. ship, a giant favor to the U.S. shipping companies. And because it is an island in the ocean, obviously Puerto Rico relies heavily on ships to bring goods to and from the U.S. mainland. Cars, building materials, food, fossil fuels, because right now 67% of Puerto Rico's electricity is generated by burning petroleum. Everything that Puerto Ricans need must be offloaded from the original carrier, reloaded onto a U.S. ship, and then be delivered to Puerto Rico in order to comply with the Jones Act. And obviously, moving all of this shit around the different boats, that adds costs to the prices of just about everything that's sold in Puerto Rico. Now, there is one major exception, which is that a foreign flagged vessel may enter directly into Puerto Rico, but only after paying really high taxes, customs, and import fees, which often double the price of the goods that they carry. Now, it would be one thing if these taxes were benefiting Puerto Rico, but they're not, because all of these import fees that are levied on foreign ships are paid to the U.S. Merchant Marines, which is part of the federal government, and not the Puerto Rican Treasury. Big profits are generated for U.S. shipping companies, and it increases revenues for the U.S. federal government. But Puerto Ricans, the citizens on that island, pay more for almost everything they buy that they can't produce themselves. How is that fair? And this is something that people in Congress are aware of, because repealing the Jones Act is an idea that's been kicked around in Congress. In fact, John McCain has been pushing for it. And so why hasn't that happened? Well, perhaps it's because shipping companies have political action committees. For example, Crowley Maritime Corporation, which is one of these shipping companies that makes a lot of money shuttling back and forth between the mainland and Puerto Rico. Well, Crowley Maritime Corporation's political action committee handed out $100,000 to 42 members of Congress in the 2016 election and spent $540,000 lobbying them. Also, these companies and many others that benefit from the Jones Act are members of a lobbying organization called the American Maritime Partnership, which has a whole section on their website defending the Jones Act, and which spent $310,000 lobbying specifically on PROMESA, which is the law that created the Fiscal Control Board to deal with Puerto Rico's debt. That bill could have repealed the Jones Act to help Puerto Rico, but it didn't. Do you think that $310,000 could have possibly had anything to do with it? When I was in Puerto Rico, I asked a few people who I had, decent, long enough conversations with, a few bartenders and Uber drivers, what they thought would help Puerto Rico's situation, specifically the island's $72 billion debt. And getting rid of the Jones Act came up more than once. There appears to be a lot of awareness by people who live there that the Jones Act is a large cause of their debt and personal struggles to afford life on the island. And the official numbers back that up. According to a 2012 study released by the Government Accountability Office, from 1970 to 2010, the Jones Act cost Puerto Rico's government $29 billion. If you project that from 1920, when the law was passed, until the present, this cost becomes $75.8 billion, which is an amount that is higher than Puerto Rico's current $72 billion public debt. In other words, if the Jones Act didn't exist, then possibly neither would the public debt of Puerto Rico. Around the same time as the passage of the Jones Act, the U.S. Supreme Court declared Puerto Rico a territory, not a state, and ruled that the U.S. Constitution did not apply there. And so when the island's Congress enacted a minimum wage law like the one we have here on the mainland, the U.S. Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. And so Charles Herbert Allen, the Sugar King, well, him and all of his other sugar plantation managers, they got their cheap labor. And as you might expect, the Puerto Ricans weren't thrilled about being denied civil rights that are granted to every other American citizen. A little over 10 years after the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution didn't apply to the citizens in Puerto Rico, the governor of Puerto Rico, who had been appointed by FDR, was Robert Hayes Gore. And proving that our campaign system based on legal bribery is not new, Gore had given $10,000 to Democratic Party leaders and supported FDR's presidential bid through his newspapers. In exchange, in August 1933, he received the appointment as Puerto Rico's governor. Now, this guy was a brilliant businessman, but he was a governor. He didn't know anything about governing, and he wasn't even sure where Puerto Rico was when he was appointed. And so the businessman governor who bought his way into office was in charge when an agricultural strike broke out in November of 1933. Governor Big Business was incapable of slowing it down. And by January of 1934, it had spread throughout the entire island. The Nationalist Party led the strike, and their strike paralyzed the island's sugar economy for an entire month. Now, the reason for the strike was that as the Great Depression worsened, the U.S. banks that controlled Puerto Rico's sugar plantations cut wages all over the island. Sugarcane workers who had gotten 75 cents for a 12-hour day in 1929 were down to 45 cents in 1933. And by January of 1934, the workers of Puerto Rico's entire sugar industry were refusing to work until their wages increased. And this freaked out the U.S. corporations and sugar companies who were profiting from the work of the Puerto Rican people. Together, the corporate titans contacted President Roosevelt and told him that, quote, a state of actual anarchy exists. Towns in a state of siege, police impotent, business paralyzed, unquote. And so finally, on February 23rd, 1934, the sugar strike was settled. The workers would receive $1.50 for a 12-hour day, double the 75 cents per day they had gotten before. The national strike was a huge success, and it increased the paychecks of the corporate wage slaves all over Puerto Rico. Now, I just want to take a minute here and acknowledge something that happened since I recorded the last episode here in modern times. Something that I know a lot of you noticed I did not support via my comments on Twitter. And I'm talking about the Day Without a Woman. For those of you who are unaware or have already forgotten it, the same people who organized the Women's March on Washington to protest the election of Donald Trump organized a national labor strike for, well, that's the thing, I don't know. The website said that it was a, quote, one-day demonstration of economic solidarity, unquote, which, what the fuck is that? That's not a demand. Now let's compare that to what was done in Puerto Rico. Puerto Ricans had an actual demand. They wanted their wages restored, and they stopped working until they got it. And when they achieved their goal, they went back to work. Puerto Ricans harnessed their power as workers, because they knew that if they didn't show up, the sugar didn't get processed, it didn't get packaged, it didn't get sold, and it didn't get profited from. And since the only thing a corporation cares about is money, the Puerto Ricans hit the corporations where it hurt, their profit margins, in order to get their fair treatment. And that is so different from what went on March 8th. There was no demand, and there was even an announced end date the next day. What was the point of that? Labor strikes, especially national ones, are a powerful tool that are not to be toyed with like that. We might need to do a real strike one day, in fact, one day soon, now that we have a walking, talking multinational corporation as president, now that he's appointed corporate CEOs to be in charge of law enforcement, and now that we have a Congress made up of the same exact people that we've been watching make laws for corporate interests for years. If you're going to wield your power as a worker in this corporate system, don't waste it. Protesting is not a game, because as Puerto Rico's history shows us, there were very real, very scary repercussions for the people that led that strike. Because as word of it spread throughout Washington and Wall Street, a message was sent back to the U.S. installed leaders in Puerto Rico. The message was that the Nationalist Party that led that strike must be stopped by any means necessary. And here's how the United States stopped the Nationalist Party, a party made up of U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico. So to restore law and order, President Roosevelt appointed a new governor, General Blanton Winship, a retired Army general from Georgia who proceeded to militarize the entire island. He created new police training camps and new U.S. military bases. He also added hundreds of men to the police force, equipping every unit with machine guns, tear gas, and riot gear. A lot like how the local police here on the mainland have been getting military equipment for at least the last 10 years. Now, the police chief at the time in Puerto Rico was Colonel E. Francis Riggs, who had worked in the military intelligence department for the U.S. federal government and who was also the heir to the Riggs National Bank fortune. Riggs National Bank headquarters was just a few hundred feet from the White House. 14 U.S. presidents or their families had banked at Riggs, and the bank specialized in private international banking for rich people. Throughout Central America, Riggs National Bank was suspected of laundering money for right-wing dictators, bribing entire Congresses, and participating in regime changes by financing military coups disguised as revolutions on behalf of the United Fruit Company. And this is not ancient history. More recently, Riggs National Bank was caught laundering money for Augusto Pinochet, the U.S. coup-installed war crime-committing, torturing dictator of Chile, and the bank was sold in 2004. So, basically, a friend of dictators was the police chief of Puerto Rico and was told by the U.S. corporate titans to stop the Nationalist Party. On October 24th, 1935, University of Puerto Rico students were holding a meeting, just a meeting, to discuss their relationship with the Nationalist Party. The police surrounded the campus and stationed themselves on every street corner with tear gas and machine guns. A squad of officers surrounded a car, and all of them started shooting. When the shooting stopped, 3 nationalists and a bystander were dead. 4 days later, Police Chief Riggs told several major newspapers that he was ready to, quote, wage war to the death against all Puerto Ricans, unquote. A few months later, on February 23, 1936, Police Chief Riggs was assassinated by 2 Puerto Ricans. The assassins were executed by the police within an hour. With his police chief dead, Governor Winship took immediate personal command of the police. Later that evening, the evening of the assassination, 2 more nationalists were shot and killed by the police. And then other nationalists just disappeared and were never heard from again. And that was only the beginning. During the following weeks, Governor Winship hired more police and instructed them to raid homes and offices, to conduct warrantless searches, to arrest people throughout the island, and to prevent citizens from traveling as they please. Things that are routinely happening to people in the United States right now. Governor Winship also prohibited all public demonstrations, which I'm hoping isn't a foreshadowing of events to come, but clearly we've allowed this to happen to U.S. citizens before. The violence peaked in Puerto Rico on March 21, 1937, when police killed 17 unarmed U.S. citizens and wounded 200 more, when for 13 minutes the police used machine guns to break up a peaceful, permitted march on the city of Ponce. They shot men, women, children, anyone in the area, many of them in the back as they ran away. No weapons, none at all, were found in the wounded or the dead. But after the gunshots stopped, perhaps realizing that this could look bad, the police staged photos intended to make it seem like the nationalists were firing upon the police. But the American Civil Liberties Union conducted a 10-day investigation in Ponce and San Juan, and they had 3 findings. First, they found that the facts showed that the affair on March 21st in Ponce was a massacre. Number 2, civil liberties had been repeatedly denied during the previous 9 months by the order of Governor Blanton Winship, who had failed to recognize the rights of free speech and assembly and threatened to use the use of force against anyone who would exercise those rights. 3, the Ponce massacre arose out of the denial by the police of the civil rights of citizens to parade and assemble, a denial ordered by the governor of Puerto Rico. Despite these findings, that this governor had slaughtered U.S. citizens for no reason, there was no police officer that was fired, demoted, suspended, convicted, jailed, or any way punished for what happened in Ponce. And Governor Winship remained the governor of Puerto Rico for over 2 more years. When I went to Puerto Rico, I wanted to see the site that this happened. I wanted to see how big of an area we were talking about that the police had closed off and just shot anyone who was in it. It was basically, it all happened on one street corner. And I can tell you that these streets could not fit more than 2 cars. We're talking about a very small area, which helped me understand how 200 people could be shot in such a short amount of time. But there was a museum there that I wanted to go to. And when you look online, it says that it's open from at least Wednesday through Sunday from 8:30 to 4:30. Ryan and I went on a Saturday at noon and it was closed. Now, I'm not going to go and say that this is some big conspiracy because I don't know why it was closed. It could be because of the budget cuts. But looking online, very few people have reviewed this museum. It's hard to get into. There was no posted hours. There was no phone number. There was nothing. And so in Ponce, they do have a museum that will apparently tell you that this happened if you can get into it. So it's just one of those ways that we have this history, but it's being subtly covered up by not allowing people to walk in and understand what happened there. Anyway, shortly after the Ponce massacre, Governor Winship arrested the leader of the Nationalist Party, Pedro Albizo Campos, on charges of trying to overthrow the U.S. government from Puerto Rico, despite a lack of evidence that he did anything other than lead a labor strike. After he was acquitted, after the jury said he was not guilty, he was not released. Instead, he was retried and convicted by a rigged jury made up of American Friends of Wall Street, and he had to serve 11 years in prison. And so this is what I mean. Protests are not a game, not when they're real. But anyway, Governor Winship was massacring citizens and locking them up with bullshit trials, and yet was still in office. And the thing that finally got Governor Winship removed from office was a speech delivered by a congressman on the floor of the House of Representatives, who listed in detail, quote, the tyrannical acts of the governor in depriving the people of Puerto Rico of their civil rights, unquote. The day after the congressman spoke out against Governor Winship on the floor of the House, FDR replaced him as the governor of Puerto Rico. And immediately after leaving the governor's mansion, Winship became a lobbyist for the U.S. corporations and sugar companies that owned the economy of Puerto Rico. His job was to persuade the U.S. Congress to exempt Puerto Rico from the Fair Labor Standards Act. His job was to have the wage and hour law amended so that the sugar companies could cut their workers' pay in half. Luckily, Winship was defeated. But at this point, I would like to remind you that part of the PROMESA bill that was signed last year was a provision that allows the Fiscal Control Board to lower the minimum wage for people under the age of 25 in Puerto Rico to $4.25 an hour. I just got back from Puerto Rico. Beer prices were pretty cheap, but everything else was either the same or more than here on the mainland. I know that there is no way I could survive on $4.25 an hour, but Congress is still letting corporations pay Puerto Ricans less than us. So many of the injustices from decades ago are still going on today. But back to the past. Even after that tall general left Puerto Rico's government, things got even more Orwellian. In the 1940s, the police working with the FBI started creating detailed personnel files on over 100,000 Puerto Rican citizens. These profiles were used to create FBI lists, and at the whim of the governor or the FBI director, anyone on the list could be in prison just for being on the list. At the same time that the FBI started creating profiles on Puerto Ricans, in November of 1940, a man named Luis Muñoz Marin was elected president of the Puerto Rican Senate. A couple years later, in April of 1943, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover received multiple reports that Luis Muñoz Marin was a drug addict. In addition, a report showed that he'd been involved in an important narcotics case, but nothing was done because Muñoz Marin would fire all of the members of the Puerto Rican government's narcotics bureau if prosecution was even considered. Muñoz Marin was a junkie, had gotten caught in a drug deal, and he'd used his public office to bury the entire thing. And this was used to blackmail him. Now, at the time, in the early 1940s, the majority of Puerto Rico's democratically elected representatives officially supported independence. But the day after Muñoz Marin, the president of the Puerto Rican Senate, was told that the FBI knew that he was a corrupt junkie, a senator from Maryland introduced a bill in the U.S. Congress that opened the door for Puerto Rican independence. But even though the majority of the Puerto Rican people wanted it, and Luis Muñoz Marin himself had run on it, Muñoz Marin opposed the independence bill. Then in 1948, acting in his new role of puppet for the U.S. government, Luis Muñoz Marin engineered the passage of Puerto Rico's Public Law 53, also known as the Gag Law. This law authorized the police and FBI to stop anyone on the street and to invade any Puerto Rican home. The law made it a felony to own or display a Puerto Rican flag, even in your own house, or to speak in favor of Puerto Rican independence. It also made it a felony to print, publish, sell, or exhibit any material that might undermine the government. Shortly afterwards, Puerto Ricans got to elect their own governor for the first time, and for some reason, they picked Luis Muñoz Marin. After he took power, he used Law 53, the Gag Law, to arrest over 3,000 people without evidence or fair trials, and to send some of them to prison for 20 years. Meanwhile, after serving 11 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, Nationalist Party leader Pedro Albizo Campos was released and returned to Puerto Rico. And long story short, When he returned to Puerto Rico, where he was under 24-hour-a-day surveillance by the FBI, he discovered that his friends were being captured and tortured in a prison called La Princesa that was literally in the shadow of the governor's mansion. He also saw that Puerto Ricans not only weren't being offered a peaceful path to independence, but they were forbidden from even saying that they wanted it. And so the Nationalist Party tried revolution, and it didn't go well. In October of 1950, the Puerto Rican Revolution started with a prison break. The next day, shootouts began in 8 Puerto Rican cities. The following day, the United States scrambled 10 fighter planes and bombed the town of Jayuya. A few hours later, 4 more planes bombed the towns of Utado more thoroughly than they had Jayuya. The 2 towns lay in ruins. This was the first time the United States had bombed our own citizens, which is a milestone that I'm still disgusted to learn that we've already crossed. And it turns out that this wasn't the last time the United States bombed our own citizens. In 1985, a Pennsylvania state helicopter bombed a house in Philadelphia in response to a shootout. The fire from the bombing burned 61 homes and killed 11 people. And it was 1985. There's video of it, and I put a link to it in the show notes. But the point is that it's no secret that our country has been bombing other countries for years using drones, and we've bombed our own country before. I didn't know that. And the pattern that I've witnessed in my adult lifetime has not been towards restraint of bombing powers, but towards allowing it. Right now, we're bombing 7 countries without declarations of war. We're illegally bombing people right now. And so what happens if we're the ones who get in the way of the powerful? If we're the ones that finally get in the way of the corporate interests who are clearly running the world? What makes us think that we're invincible? Because clearly, history tells us we're not. We're allowing really dangerous people to control this country. But back to the revolution. At the same time that 2 Puerto Rican towns were being bombed to rubble, 2 Puerto Rican men tried to assassinate President Harry Truman to send a message that the revolution was a war between 2 countries. Now, obviously, they failed. But in the news reports about the attempted assassination, none of the major newspapers mentioned that the hometowns of the assassins had just been bombed. All of these things that I've told you about so far about the way Puerto Ricans had been treated weren't highlighted. Mainland Americans didn't know. We still don't know. And we're still reading those same papers for our information. But regardless, immediately after the revolt, Governor Luis Muñoz Marin declared martial law throughout Puerto Rico. The U.S. military locked down entire towns, blocked roads, and searched cars. FBI agents, police, and National Guardsmen raided thousands of homes and arrested anyone who even knew a nationalist. Within a matter of days, over 3,000 people had been arrested. In prison, the nationalists, also known as U.S. citizens, were treated like animals. They had bright lights shined in their cells 24 hours a day. They were given no sheets, towels, or toilet paper, and no showers were allowed for weeks. Visitors and contact with anyone outside the prisons was prohibited, and the leaders were all placed in solitary confinement. One of the leaders who was thrown in solitary at La Princesa, the prison located within feet of the governor's mansion, was Pedro Albizo Campos, the leader of the Nationalist Party who had already served 11 years on bullshit charges. While in prison in La Princesa, 6 months before his trial, odd light somehow started coming through the concrete walls of his cell, causing him to pass out. When he woke up, he had a splitting headache and a full-body sunburn. These lights continued every day. After a week, he reported that his legs, hands, head, and just about every part of his body was experiencing extreme swelling. But in solitary confinement, he couldn't tell anyone. He sent multiple letters to the prison warden, who just ignored them. And it wasn't just Pedro Albizo Campos who found this out to be true. Other prisoners in La Princesa were reporting the same radiation. At a doctor's suggestion, 2 prisoners were temporarily moved into Albizo Campos' cell, and almost immediately they started complaining of headaches and radiation burns. The warden also switched a second group of prisoners into that cell, and they wrote a letter on June 7, 1951, complaining of electronic rays. In August of 1951, after months of complaining about the radiation burns he was experiencing in his cell, FBI files showed that the government declared him mentally and physically able to stand trial, basically saying, this guy's okay. However, other documents from the same exact time period declared him paranoid and insane when he complained about being burned by electronic rays. There are also other FBI reports that back up Pedro Albizo Campos' claims. Files sent to J. Edgar Hoover himself acknowledged that Albizo was, quote, physically incapacitated with body swellings, unquote. That he had, quote, more bluish marks appearing on his body, unquote. He had, quote, fever and pain, high blood pressure, headaches, and swelling on his legs, unquote. and that he was in, quote, such bad health that he can scarcely walk, unquote. Despite all of this, for 5 years, from 1951 to 1956, nothing was done about Albizo Campos's medical condition. The United States kept sending in teams of psychiatrists into his cell, all of whom declared him insane. The United States government was also spying on and trashed independent doctors who were sent to evaluate Albizo Campos. Over and over, he stated that the radiation was intended to induce either a stroke or a heart attack, and he had a stroke in March of 1956. For 2 days, or longer according to his wife, he didn't get medical help for his stroke. And for the rest of his short life, he was paralyzed and was never able to speak again, which is what I'm guessing was the point of his torture. Now, it's tough to say for sure that radiation-induced torture is what happened here, because after he died, the United States government refused to investigate and refused to allow a radiologist or nuclear physicist to examine Albizo's body. But there are some dots that, when connected, lead to some strong evidence that Albizo Campos was a guinea pig for a mass radiation experiment, and far from the only one. In November of 1986, Congressman, now Senator, Ed Markey of Massachusetts delivered a report to the House Committee on Energy and Commerce titled, quote, American Nuclear Guinea Pigs, 3 Decades of Radiation Experiments on U.S. Citizens, unquote. This report covered 695 people exposed to radiation in 31 experiments sponsored by the U.S. Army and the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission from the 1940s to the 1970s. The report says that some people participated willingly, but some were, quote, captive audiences, unquote, who did not give consent, such as elderly people, hospital patients with terminal diseases, and prisoners. Here's a quote from the congressional report, quote, during May of 1945 at the Clinton Laboratory in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, 2 groups of 10 subjects were exposed to beta rays to determine the dose that would begin to cause reddening of the skin, unquote. Now, let's take note of 2 things there. The date of these experiments was 1945. Pedro Albizo Campos was put in La Princesa prison in 1951, after those experiments were already done in Tennessee. Also, the location. The experiments were conducted in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Well, in February and March of 1951, Dr. Marshall Brewster, the director of the medical division of the Oak Ridge Institute for Nuclear Studies, as in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, well, he visited Puerto Rico. The declassified FBI records for Albizo Campos omit the entire period of Dr. Brewster's visit to the island, which coincides exactly with Albizo's first report of radiation in his cell. In a separate U.S. Department of Energy report released in 1995, we also learned that the federal government conducted radiation experiments on up to 20,000 men, women, and children between World War II and the mid-1970s. 435 confirmed experiments used children, mental patients, mentally disabled people, and prison inmates. In many cases, many documented, proven cases, these individuals were exposed to lethal beams of radiation and they died. And just to show you how sick these fuckers were, in one study, 54 mentally disabled children at the Walter E. Fornando School in Waltham, Mass. were told that they were joining a science club and would be given gifts or trips to Red Sox games if they joined. The retarded kids were then fed radioactive materials in their cereal for 10 years, from 1946 until 1956. In 1998, MIT and Quaker Oats agreed to pay $1.85 million to the children who were in the science club. And so that actually happened. So if the U.S. government was willing to trick handicapped children into participating in their radiation experiments at that time, is it so far-fetched to think that they could have cooked the leader of the Nationalist Party in his cell? The guy who led the labor strike that forced the sugar industry to pay their workers double, costing the industry precious profits? The leader of the party, which was to be destroyed by any means necessary. Even today, there's plausible deniability about his death. We can't prove the federal government had anything to do with it. But he sure was silenced, wasn't he? Within 5 years of being locked up in La Princesa, he went from healthy to dead, and there's no blood or fingerprints. At the same time that these radiation experiments are happening on prisoners all over the country. But when it comes to Pedro Albizo Campos, no one knows for sure what happened. And unfortunately, we never will. Now, obviously, this story is disturbing as all hell. And so when I went to Puerto Rico, I wanted to see this prison. I wanted to see La Princesa. Because I've only told you a small portion of the horrible things that went down there. And so I wanted to see how close it was to the governor's mansion. Was there any way that the leaders of the country didn't know? I wanted to see if it was still a prison or if it was a museum, like a Holocaust museum, documenting what happened to make sure that it never happens again. And so I started my search for the prison with a Google search. But when I Googled La Princesa in downtown San Juan or Old San Juan, it showed me a promenade, a pretty one with statues and shit. But I couldn't find the prison. And so I had to dig a bit deeper. But what I discovered is that the prison was no longer a prison. It was a completely different building. It still existed. They didn't actually tear it down. But now it's the Department of Tourism. So Ryan and I went there. And when you walk in the door, it looks like an office building. It looks super boring. And when you walk in the door, there is a plaque next to the door that acknowledges in English and Spanish that this once was a prison. When you walk in, it looks like the most boring museum you've ever seen. There are 2 long hallways on either side where I'm sure the prison cells used to be. They're now probably office buildings, but I don't know. I wasn't allowed to walk down those hallways. But we walked in and there was a teeny tiny little area with exhibits. And then we walked into the back courtyard. There's nothing in this courtyard. There's like 2 tables, maybe 4 chairs, nothing. There's no paintings. There's no reason for anyone to be there. But I wanted to see if there was any signs at all that this used to be a torture prison. And so I'm standing in the courtyard and I look over to the right and I see a creepy staircase headed down. And so I went and I took a picture of it. And then I noticed that right behind this staircase, there was I can't even call it a walkway. It was a gap between 2 walls. It was about the size of a person. There's no way I could have stuck my arm out. And there was no way Ryan and I could have walked next to each other through this, I guess we'll call it a walkway. But it was just a gap between the walls. And I decided to walk through it. And on the other side of that gap were 3 prison cells. And there were no plaques. There was no explanation. And there was nothing there to even indicate that I was allowed to be there. But there they were. There were these 3 stoned prison cells. And I was obviously really creeped out. But I wanted to go in there. I had been so scared by the stuff that I had read in this book about the things our country has already done to U.S. citizens. And so I went into all 3 cells, and I've got to tell you, they were small and they were scary. There were no toilets, there was no sinks. It was just concrete cells. And it was one of these cells. I don't know if it was one of those specifically, but it was a cell like this where Pedro Albizo Campos had been radiated by something in the 1950s. And as I stood there, here I am doing this podcast that I'm screwing with the most powerful people in the world, and I know it. I feel like I'm putting myself in danger even telling you this story because this is a story that, they're not overtly hiding it. Like the Ponce Massacre Museum, it exists even though it's closed at noon on a Saturday. And La Princesa, it still exists, but it's now being hidden as the Department of Tourism. And the only way that you would ever know that these jail cells were there is if you went through this creepy gap in the wall. So it's hidden right there in plain sight, but it's definitely hidden. It's not information that is being publicized by our government in any way. And it made me feel like maybe I'm looking into my own future here. And I know this is scary, and right now I'm feeling bad because I know that my parents listen to this, but I definitely sensed a sense of danger because our country has been doing this for a long time. I've known that. But this is the first time that I realized that we've done this to U.S. citizens on U.S. soil. And it made me feel like I am definitely putting myself on the target list by doing this. So when I say that this episode hit me deep, that's what I mean. I've been having nightmares about those cells because I don't want to end up in one, So it's like, I don't know. I just kind of feel like I have 2 choices. I either continue with this podcast and hope that I get big enough that people would notice and, fight for me if I disappeared, or hope that we actually change the country, that we fire everyone in Congress and we end up with better people who want to make the world a better place instead of a scarier, place full of torture. Or I stop doing this podcast and take myself out of danger. And yeah, so that's kind of what's going on in my head. And I'm not announcing that the podcast is over by any means, but I do want you to know that this scared the living shit out of me, to know that we have treated our own citizens this way, and that I'm purposely putting myself in danger by talking about these things. Because Pedro Albizo Campos, he led a revolution, but the first time he was put in jail, he led a labor strike. That's not against the law. He didn't break any laws. I'm not breaking any laws, but I'm also screwing with the powerful. So yeah, that's how I'm being haunted by this episode. But enough about my need for therapy. Let's get back to the story. So let's see. With the death of Pedro Albizo Campos and the campaign of mass arrests of anyone who identified with the independence movement in any way, the Nationalist Party was eliminated, pretty much. I mean, independence, at least from what I saw, doesn't seem to be a goal anymore on the island, at least not for the majority. And the numbers back that up. The trend ever since the squashing of the Nationalists has been towards statehood. And so basically, those who gave in survived. And the following generations are pretty Americanized. And a lot has changed on the island. In 1957, a year after Pedro Albizo Campos died, the U.S. Supreme Court declared Public Law 53, the gag law, unconstitutional. So that largely stopped the unjustified mass arrests. And in the decades that followed, the island's economy shifted drastically too. From the mid-1950s until 2006, the United States made Puerto Rico a corporate tax haven. U.S. corporations were given 10 and 20-year tax exemptions on all gross revenues, dividends, and interest, and capital gains income. So instead of an economy based on sugarcane, Puerto Ricans switched to manufacturing. Now, one of those tax haven laws was known as Act 936, a deal that let corporations get out of paying taxes that was repealed by Congress and the Clinton administration. It was eventually fully phased out in 2006. And it's been blamed by many, including myself in Congressional Dish 128, for killing the manufacturing industry in Puerto Rico. In fact, here's the guy who was governor at the time that PROMESA was passed, Garcia Padilla.
The loss of Section 936 benefits significantly contributed to the crippling of our economy and led directly to the recession that began in 2006.
But in my conversation with Luis Balzac, who again was a high-ranking official in the Puerto Rican State Department, he had a different take on the situation.
Remember, the pharmaceutical industry way back when, and we're talking about right after Puerto Rico changed from an agricultural economy to a manufacturing economy. Okay? So I really need you to follow me on this. Puerto Rico used to be sugarcane industry.
Yeah.
And it changed. Okay, my great uncle was the governor of Puerto Rico for the other party, Commonwealth Party, and him and Governor Luis Muñoz Marin came up with these tax incentives with the federal government in 1936 were invented, and Puerto Rico changed completely and became a manufacturing economy. No more sugarcane, now we're manufacturing. And when that happened, pharma came to Puerto Rico. But we have to remember that the manufacturing industry also included probably the largest textile industry. Textile was huge in Puerto Rico.
Is it still there?
No. Why? Now, you're smart. Why do you think textile is done in Puerto Rico? Where is textile nowadays?
Probably China, India.
Yes. So in this case, it left to other jurisdictions with minimum wage and for a bunch of other reasons. 936, yes, it was not great when it left, but the industry changed. Textile goes wherever you have cheapest labor. And Puerto Rico cannot compete with India, China, Dominican Republic, where people get paid $1 an hour. You'll forget it. You can't compete with that.
And it sounds like the same problem we're having in California and Texas and Massachusetts and everywhere.
Yes.
And Luis also wanted to talk a bit more about the pharmaceutical industry. So here you go.
Let's talk for a second about the pharmaceutical industry. Okay?
Yeah, just so that I'm on the same page. You worked for Pfizer for a while too, right?
I directed government affairs for Pfizer, and that included jurisdictions of New York City and Puerto Rico.
Okay. And when did you do that?
I did that I took a year off the government and I went to Pfizer. Did not like it, then went back to Puerto Rico government.
But was this before the Clinton administration took away the tax credits or after?
Oh, after. Way after.
Okay.
2011, before I became Deputy Secretary of State.
Okay, got you. So this is after all the tax benefits were gone, and was Pfizer still... when did the pharmaceutical industry leave Puerto Rico? When did they leave?
No, wait. Why are you saying that?
Because that's what I read. Is that not what?
No, that's wrong. I'm about to clarify that.
Okay.
All right. So if you look at the pharmaceutical industry, if you search, let's say, bio, I believe bio is still pharmaceutical, big pharma association, industry association, trade association, okay? If you look at that, you will see that in Puerto Rico, bio had a membership of a huge number of pharmaceuticals. And then you may look at bio now, and the Puerto Rico chapter, which has another name, has way less pharmaceuticals. So the normal person who doesn't understand how things work will say, well, everyone left. Well, let's slow down and look at what are the names that are missing. Well, some of those names don't exist anymore because the industry has completely merged and consolidated their resources. By way of example, I will tell you that in Puerto Rico alone, Pfizer bought Wyeth.
Oh, okay. So, okay, gotcha. So Pfizer got bigger by eating a smaller company.
Correct, and there's nothing wrong with that. So what happened was that I believe at that time when that happened, Pfizer had 3 operations in Puerto Rico. Wyeth had 3 operations in Puerto Rico. Okay? So now when they merge, they have 6 plants in Puerto Rico. So what do? They are able to do economies of scale and to do streamline, and they are able to close 2 and stay with 4. And now Wyeth is not in Puerto Rico.
Is the effect of that of the people of Puerto Rico that the people that worked in those 2 plants are now out of a job?
But it has nothing to do with 936.
Remind me, I did that episode like 8 months ago. 936 was the tax credit disappearing? Was that?
That's a tax credit that disappeared with the Clintons, that you said.
Okay, thank you.
So that consolidation, that example that I'm sharing with you, I believe all happened after 936 stopped. But the reason why Pfizer and Wyeth consolidated was for reasons that had nothing to do with 936.
Yeah.
It had a lot to do with being more productive, being able to share assembly lines, and being able to share resources, and the same CEO, and all that stuff. And so, to the untrained eye, to the Puerto Rican, what they think or see is, Wyeth left. No, they didn't leave. It was absorbed by a larger pharmaceutical.
So is the pharmaceutical industry still a major employer in Puerto Rico?
Yes, it is. And I will tell you something else. Pfizer is now, and many pharmaceuticals for many years are enjoying tax benefits under something called CFC, Controlled Foreign Corporations. And they are able to enjoy benefits that are comparable to 936. It's just a different name, a different loophole, you want to call it. I don't want to call it a loophole. It's a different tax advantage.
And when I was in Puerto Rico, I did notice that the pharmaceutical industry is in fact still there. As Ryan and I were driving around, we noticed some of the plants. I believe we saw a Pfizer plant and we saw Bristol Myers Squibb, and they were huge. And so I apologize for being wrong in Congressional Dish 128. I'm glad that Luis cleared that up. But like he said, there was the loss of the 936 law, but there's also these different laws. So here is some more information on these not a loopholes, these different tax advantages that corporations and rich people are now able to take advantage of in Puerto Rico.
So you understand that the reason why people are going to Puerto Rico is because of Law 20 and 22, right?
I don't know, no.
So I wanted to share with you, so Law 20 and Law 22, those laws were passed by Governor Luis Fortuño, which is the governor that I worked for. And those 2 laws were used, pushed, and promoted big time by the previous governor, Alejandro Garcia Padilla. And you can do a quick Google, and you will see how Wall Street went nuts over those 2 laws. And those 2 laws is the sole reason why people in stateside, mainland U.S., are fleeing to Puerto Rico to enjoy those tax benefits.
Well, what are those benefits?
I'm going to tell you. Okay. So first you have Law 20. Law 20 is better known as Export Services Law, meaning you and I can open a corporation in Puerto Rico that export services, outside of Puerto Rico. Services, not manufacturing. So you and I can open a consulting firm that consults on any issue. And if our clients are not in Puerto Rico, if our clients are in Europe or New York or California, when that company in Puerto Rico bills those accounts, that corporation will only pay local 4% tax and no federal tax.
Wow. Okay, that's crazy.
Okay? So that means that you and I can have an existing company and have a law firm in New York, and you and I are the partners, and we're like, oh, whoa, and let's say that half of our clients are, not in Puerto Rico. So why don't we just open an office in Puerto Rico and do all of our billing out of Puerto Rico and serve those clients from Puerto Rico? By the way, you and I can hire attorneys in Puerto Rico that are bilingual, graduated from Harvard, Yale, all those top universities, pay them a fraction of what you and I would pay a lawyer in New York, and we bill them to the clients that are outside Puerto Rico, and we only pay 4% tax. That's Law 20. It's beautiful.
Wow. Okay.
All right. So now Law 20 was complemented by Law 22. Law 22 is called the Investor Act. So now you and I are the partners of that law firm, and we've moved operations, and the corporation is only paying 4% tax, local tax, okay?
Okay.
Got it. You and I have not lived in Puerto Rico for the last 15 years.
Okay.
So you and I have our attorneys will review Law 20, and what Law 20 says is you and I can move to Puerto Rico personally, and when we're in Puerto Rico, our Puerto Rico sourced income will be tax-free.
So the income, is that included? So it's the Investment Act. So are you talking about, like, instead of paying capital gains tax, they pay nothing?
Pay nothing. Now it needs to be Puerto Rico sourced income. That means that if you and I own Apple shares or Microsoft, okay, and we move to Puerto Rico, that passive income will pay taxes because that income is generated outside of Puerto Rico.
Okay.
But if you and I go to Puerto Rico, like Paltry and Paulson move to Puerto Rico, and we invest in property, and we invest in any business in Puerto Rico, that Puerto Rico source income will be tax-free.
Federally, or is there any state taxes?
Both.
Wow. So the state doesn't even get anything from that?
Well, yeah, they do, because think about all the jobs, and it's crazy how much money is generated by having those people in Puerto Rico. Of course, it generates.
I guess that makes sense.
It's called economic development. Yes, it generates. I have a lot of people that have no accounts with those individuals, all the way from real estate, legal fees, engineering, and all millions and millions and millions of dollars that were not moving around the economy until they moved there.
And so are these two laws something that you personally support? Are they a good idea?
I think it's a good idea. We somehow need to generate some type of activity.
We do, but at the same time, your government is broke. So isn't raising revenues, isn't that a solution?
Well, you know what? It's a little contradicting. So when I say I endorse it, but I just told you a little while ago that I want to be a state. And if I was a state, that would probably not be possible.
Yeah.
Those two laws would not be possible for a state. But guess what? We're not a state.
Yeah.
And what the heck are we supposed to do?
Yeah. I guess that's true. You got to play the hand you're dealt. Okay.
I would rather not have those two laws and be a state.
Okay. That's fair.
But here's the thing that I just can't seem to get over, no matter how many times I hear that clip. By exempting the really, really rich people from paying taxes, the money to fund the government has to come from somewhere, and the responsibility seems to have fallen to the not filthy rich people who have been living in and loyal to Puerto Rico the entire time. Before Puerto Rico's credit was downgraded to junk status, the Puerto Rican government tried to please their Wall Street overlords by laying off 30,000 workers, charging 67% more for water, raising electricity rates, raising property and small business taxes, hiking the gasoline tax twice in 1 year, cutting public pensions and health benefits, raising the retirement age, closing 200 schools, and hiking the sales tax to 11.5%. And yet Wall Street, the bankers, still weren't pleased, which we know because the island's credit rating was downgraded to junk status. But the point I want to make here is that the island is baiting the rich in the hope of some trickle-down miracles occurring from their mere presence on the island and making everyone else pay more to make up the difference. For example, while legit Puerto Rican citizens get nickeled and dimed on everything they buy, billionaire New Yorker John Paulson has moved to Puerto Rico and has gobbled up a bunch of properties that he's paying like no taxes on. This includes the Condado Vanderbilt and La Concha Renaissance, the San Juan Beach Hotel, the St. Regis Bahia Beach Resort, and a 326,000 square foot building being used by AIG, which are hotels and businesses that would likely still be there regardless of John Paulson's residency. He also owns 8.6% of Banco Popular, the island's largest bank, and I can't help but mention that John Paulson is one of the shady motherfuckers who invented this bundled subprime mortgage scams, the swaps, and then bet against them to make $15 billion. That's not an exaggeration. That's how much he made, which is behavior that was a direct cause of the 2008 financial crash. But now, as a major shareholder in Banco Popular and a hedge fund manager, Paulson owns a large share of Puerto Rico's public debt. And so if Puerto Rico can't pay back the debt, then Paulson would own a portion of Puerto Rico's physical infrastructure. So like the water, electricity, schools, roads, bridges, as the underlying collateral for this debt. Now, obviously, John Paulson didn't write the laws that created this no matter who loses, John Paulson wins situation, although he has given millions to the Republicans in Congress who did. But it does make me question the strategy of creating sweetheart deals for a few billionaires like Paulson as a solution to the debt crisis. I just don't see how a handful of rich people can possibly spend enough to prop up the finances of an entire island, especially when their investments are purchases of things like hotels that have been there for decades. Hotels that were paying taxes before being bought by billionaires who should probably be in jail for the damage they've inflicted on us all. But I digress. Speaking of taxes, while Puerto Rico and Congress has decided to exempt the super rich from paying them, normal Puerto Ricans who work for a living, they do pay taxes. And here's some more of my conversation about that with Luis.
Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico, contrary to common opinion, we do pay some federal taxes. What we don't pay is federal income tax. So we don't pay federal income tax. However, Puerto Ricans pay Medicare at the same rate that you pay in San Francisco.
Do Puerto Ricans get the same benefits that I get in San Francisco?
No, we do not get the same benefits that you get in San Francisco.
Oh.
So, for example, there are states like California, New York, and other states that I believe get about an 83% federal subsidy for Medicare expenses. There are other states, and I realize I'm being recorded, but don't quote me on it. This you can check also very easily.
Sure. And you don't have to give me exact numbers. Just go ahead and big picture tell me the situation. Yeah.
Even better. So there are states like California and New York that get about 80-some% of reimbursement on their Medicare expenses by the federal government. There are other states that get less. I think Tennessee gets less. I think Tennessee gets 50-some%. Puerto Rico, I think it gets about 23%.
Oh, God.
It's important to understand that where does the other, if we use 23% as an example for Medicare, where does the other 77% come from? State funding.
Okay.
So please understand that if you move to Puerto Rico as a U.S. citizen and you, for any reason, need Medicare and you go to the hospital, those hospitals that you go to have to comply with MCF, which is part of HHS, Health and Human Services. And you have to comply with all the regulations and requirements of a hospital to be reimbursed and enjoy federal dollars. However, that institution / Puerto Rico is only getting cents on the dollar compared to other states, but someone needs to make up for that shortfall.
Yeah.
The state does. That lack of equality translates to Puerto Rico's budget.
Another federal program that's unequally distributed to U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico is Medicaid. Medicaid is basically health care for poor people, and the way it works for the states is that the states pay for some of it and the federal government picks up the rest of the tab, no matter how much it is. Now, one of Paul Ryan's wet dreams is to change how Medicaid works so that it's block granted, which means that the federal government would give the states a certain amount, and when they run out, tough, let people die. Thing is that this is already how it works in Puerto Rico. Their Medicaid is already block granted, and surprise, surprise, Congress underfunds it. It's not nearly enough to cover every eligible person who needs it. And this is going to hurt Puerto Ricans soon, as an Affordable Care Act Medicaid grant is expected to run out before the end of this year. Now, this not only obviously contributes to Puerto Rico's debt, because Puerto Rico is not just going to let people die. So what they're doing is they're going into debt to cover what Medicaid is not covering. So that is a part of the debt story. But also, in letters that were recently written by Puerto Rico's resident commissioner in Congress to governors of 13 states, Speaker Paul Ryan and the Fiscal Control Board, not a real Congresswoman, Jennifer Gonzalez Colon, who represents Puerto Rico, is trying to warn Puerto Rico's overlords that 470,000 people on the island would have to be kicked off Medicaid if the money is allowed to run out. And Luis explained why this is our problem here in the States.
When I ran the office of the governor of Puerto Rico in New York, and we were lobbying to be included into the Affordable Care Act, my biggest argument when I met with members of the Senate or the House in states that had a large Puerto Rican population, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, by way of example, my point to these members of Congress was, I need your help. I need you to be a voice to Puerto Rico to be included in the Affordable Care Act. And the staff would be like, are you kidding me, Luis? That is none of our business. And I would be like, well, give me an opportunity to maybe convince you that it is your business.
Yeah, because you'll pay for them when they come here.
You will pay for it. And by the way, we don't even have a way to qualify it, because guess what? A lot of them are coming in, getting services, and going back to Puerto Rico once they're done. Some are staying. Some are staying. But others are just coming here, and you have no way of qualifying and quantifying it because they're United States citizens. You can't stop it.
Yeah.
How could you blame them if Puerto Rico does not have the facilities to treat a cancer or SSI or any other, initiative, and my mother is risking her life? I'm going to take her to Orlando. Mm-hmm. Without a doubt.
And it's not just patients who are leaving Puerto Rico. Doctors are leaving the island at a rate of 1 per day in search of more money. There were 14,000 doctors in Puerto Rico in 2006, and there were 9,000 last year. There's only one cardiosurgeon left on the entire island. And I got to tell you, when I was there, that was the one thing that I did feel uncomfortable with being in Puerto Rico, is knowing that reality. I mean, that is one place where I do not want to get sick. Now, that said, I don't want to make Puerto Rico sound like some sort of a hellscape, because it's not at all. And in fact, I could totally see myself living there. I loved it. One of the things that I was actually surprised about was the lack of horrific poverty, because I feel like Puerto Rico has a reputation for being full of tragic poor people. But honestly, I didn't see it. There are a lot of rather rundown houses and a lot of empty houses due to the exodus of people and the banks not selling the properties. But I didn't see tent cities, and I was only approached for money once in 6 days. To tell you the truth, I see far worse poverty every single day here in the San Francisco Bay Area than I saw in Puerto Rico, which I actually think says more about San Francisco and Oakland than Puerto Rico, but still. I went expecting to see drastic differences between rich neighborhoods and poor, and I just didn't. I did, however, notice so many people who set up little pop-up businesses all over the place. They were selling food and trinkets and tigers and bikes, all kinds of stuff in cities and on the sides of roads. And Luis gave me some insight into what it was that I witnessed.
I will say that Puerto Rico, even though we have all the issues that you and I have been talking about, we are still part of the United States, and it's somewhat similar to the changes that we see here stateside in the continuous 48 states, where I would say that from coast to coast, from Florida to California, I think the middle class in the United States has been shrinking. Mm-hmm. Likewise in Puerto Rico. But I would say that it is more like the United States, and we are not like Latin America and other third world jurisdictions. We have a decent-sized middle class because we don't have the IRS, because we are not paying federal income tax. There is in Puerto Rico a large underground economy where people work on the side, get paid in cash, and don't report their earnings to there's no IRS, or to the local version of the IRS, which is the Treasury Department. So what you have is, in Puerto Rico, is that you see a somewhat of a thriving economy for those people that are in commercial real estate and they're doing business with big national chains like Macy's and JCPenney's and all that stuff. You will see in Puerto Rico sales records being broken and people spending a lot of money in the island. So it's not like the Dominican Republic. Even people in the projects that are subsidized by state and federal dollars, you can see that they have AC in the walls. The projects are made out of cement, and you will be able to see all that when you go there in person. So when you drive around Puerto Rico, all over the island, it is nothing like the Dominican Republic. We are way better.
Well, I've never been there either, so that comparison doesn't really...
We are way better, and I realize that I'm about to contradict myself, okay? We are way better, and it is thanks to the United States. So even though inequality has brought all these problems, and it has affected the debt and all that stuff, and we are looking now at serious issues, Puerto Rico is still better than... I would never move to Cuba because I think Cuba is better than Puerto Rico. Forget it. Puerto Rico is the United States, and we're doing better than most.
And so after I got home and kind of saw that reality to be true for myself, I looked at some of the numbers. And it turns out that of the island's approximately 3.5 million people, only 1 million people work in the formal economy. And so, for instance, since 1996, factory jobs on the island have spiraled down from 160,000 to 75,000. But despite that lack of formal factory jobs, that doesn't mean that people are not working. They probably are. They're just doing it off the record and in cash, which is a dynamic that also doesn't help the government with its debt problem because all that cash swapping is unreported and untaxed. But speaking of the debt, let's get back to the topic that started this entire Puerto Rican rabbit hole, the Fiscal Control Board that was imposed by Congress last year. I wanted to know how Luis, someone who has actually governed in Puerto Rico, feels about it.
So that brings me to the control board, because now we have Puerto Ricans saying, on paper, no doubt we want to become a state, and yet Congress just did this thing where your government, your state government, or closest thing, what do you call it, territorial government?
Yeah.
Is that the proper phrase? Okay.
Yeah.
So your territorial government was basically just taken over by this weird board that has some dictatorial powers. Is there anyone in Puerto Rico that's happy about this? Is there something I'm not seeing?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna compare that. First of all, let's be fair, and we're not the first jurisdiction that, let's say, enjoys the benefit of a control board, because D.C., New York City, both had it in different jurisdiction relationships, but they did, and it helped. Okay. Now, the difference between New York City is the following. You have a city that was imposed a board by the state. So people in the city of New York, even though they had a control board years back, they had a control board, and that was decided by politicians who they elected.
Yeah.
So that makes it, but it's still the same in that you have a higher jurisdiction imposing a control board for fiscal reasons over a lower jurisdiction, correct?
Yes.
And then you have D.C. They also had a control board, and it was imposed by the federal government, if I'm not mistaken. So there you have a jurisdiction of a federal government imposing in D.C., which is not independent. Now, let me tell you where emotions can go a little crazy here. Remember, I'm a state voter. I'm pro-American.
Yeah.
However, we did not invite the United States of America back 100 and some years ago. We were invaded.
Yeah.
So we are invaded. We are treated unequally. That inequality causes financial chaos. we are told by the Supreme Court that our Constitution is not really a Constitution. You should research that. That was recent, an opinion by the Supreme Court. So really our Constitution that we thought we had a Constitution is not worth anything on paper because Congress has complete control of that jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. So what we have is, back to your question about a board, is a federal government imposing a board on people who did not vote for those that imposed that board.
Yeah, and I know that in Congress, Puerto Rico has a representative. At the time that this was created, I think it was Pedro, but he didn't have a vote. So, no. And even on the board, the governor gets to sit at the table, but the governor of Puerto Rico doesn't get a vote on the board.
Now, since the board was created, Puerto Rico elected a new governor, a 37-year-old cutie pie son of a former governor named Ricardo Rossello. And this kid signed up for one hell of a difficult job because it's the governor who is charged with doing the hard work of actually creating the budget, but the board gives him the rules and decides if it'll be implemented. And so the 5 priorities of the board, the rules the governor has to base the budget around, are these, as outlined by the Fiscal Control Board in January. So first, the Fiscal Control Board wants some revenue enhancements, specifically wants better audits, wants to reduce tax exemptions, and also wants Puerto Rico to do a better job of collecting property taxes and to give less money back to the island cities, which are things that will obviously hit the residents of Puerto Rico in their pocketbooks. Second, the Fiscal Control Board wants the governor to do some government right-sizing, which is a Orwellian term to mean government reducing. And one of their strategies for this is obviously privatization. We saw this coming from a mile away. And this is a quote from their letter to the governor. It said, quote, "Today, the government directly provides and subsidizes many services, including security, transportation, and other activities that could be provided by the private sector," unquote. The Fiscal Control Board also wants Puerto Rico to reduce wages for government workers, which we've seen many times in Puerto Rico's history. The Fiscal Control Board also wants the government to stop performing non-essential services. We don't know exactly which ones those are. And the Fiscal Control Board wants the government to reduce money on K through 12 education. Now, on the issue of education, Luis and I did discuss it, and he had a take on the reducing money for schools and closing schools, a very different take than I was, I guess, expecting, but it's an interesting perspective. So here you go.
Education. I think that your podcast touched on education and about 100 schools being closed.
Yeah.
Yeah, but how many people have moved to Orlando? We do
so there's not as many kids?
No. Now I'm going to defend this. So with me, you may go crazy because I jump from side to side. So for one part of me says, I do that
too. I totally get it.
One part of me says the student body. I think the island student population went down from 500,000 to 400,000 students. That's 25%.
Okay.
Okay. That means that I should be able to cut 25% of schools and 25% of my budget, right? Well, let's look at the other side. You and I, again, are married, right? And you and I are broke, and we have 2 kids. And the schools that we have our kids are 3 blocks away. Beautiful. You and I bought the house because it was right next to school. So now they're going to close that school, and the next school is 5 miles away.
Yeah.
You and I are pissed.
Of course.
I don't give a crap that there's less students. You know, I'm going to pick it, and I'm going to make a lot of noise, and I'm going to make it impossible for the government to close that school, which is what happens. You know what? Somebody else should sacrifice. Not my wife and I. We have it good. I like to be able to walk 3 blocks and grab my children by the hand and have a beautiful conversation with them while we eat cookies and we go to the school right next door. Well, guess what? The population is so much smaller now that somehow we cannot justify having the same number of schools open. I believe that happened in Chicago and other jurisdictions. We have to adjust. So guess who needs to deliver those bad news? The Fiscal Control Board. Because you cannot possibly justify having all those schools open. So who's going to be the bad guy? thank God there's a fiscal control board, because if you allow the local elected official to make those decisions, it will be political suicide. And that transfers to any state. Ask any governor to close down 25% of schools, and they're going to lose the election.
Well, I mean, I think that's just a part of the job. The problem that I'm seeing as...
No, but wait a second. The problem is that the governor can't do it, because when you commit political suicide and you need to support the legislature to do that, the elected officials in the legislative body will be the first ones that won't back you up. They'll say, are you crazy? I'm not going to back you up. I want to get elected next time. That's your problem. He says, I can't do it without you. And we were like, so let's not do it. Let's let the other guy do it. And he's like, no, we don't have enough money. The students are living in Orlando and New York. They moved away. We don't need so many schools. We need to close. And the senator will be like, I'm not going to pass that law. Are you kidding me? We're all going to be out of a job.
Well, and that's the thing. Like, maybe you're not supposed to serve forever. Like, I just feel like those tough decisions are a part of a job of being elected. And one of my concerns with this control board is that those families, they can't petition to this board. There is no voice for the Puerto Ricans where the governor doesn't have a vote. I guess I'd feel more comfortable with it if I thought that those families could petition to their governor and it would be one vote at the table that would have those political calculations in mind. But with these 7 people that were selected by Congress, I mean, is there any concern that they're going to prioritize the bankers over the Puerto Rican people?
I think a lot of people are concerned about that.
So there's some logic there for sure. I'm just still not entirely sold that a fiscal control board is the best way to do this. I still think that maybe the politicians in Puerto Rico should stop being such pussies and being so afraid of their voters and losing their cushy government jobs. But yeah, that's just my opinion. But moving on, so here's the third way that the fiscal control board wants the governor to create his budget. Number 3 is that the fiscal control board wants the governor to reduce healthcare spending, as if they haven't reduced it enough. One of the bits of advice that the Fiscal Control Board has is that Puerto Rico shouldn't count on any more Affordable Care Act funding from Congress when it expires. The Fiscal Control Board also said that Puerto Rico should, quote, reduce use utilization, unquote, which basically means to find ways to get people to use less health care. And they said straight up that there should be cuts in coverage and benefits. The Fiscal Control Board's number 4 request of the governor's budget goes back to education. The Fiscal Control Board wants Puerto Rico to reduce spending on colleges. And the way they want the governor to do this is they want Puerto Rico to increase tuition and get students to borrow more money from the federal government. And once again, they want to right size the staff, which means that they want to reduce the staff. And then last, the 5th thing on the Fiscal Control Board's list is that they want pension cuts, and they want future accounts to be individual accounts. So that means that all future government employees shouldn't have actual pensions. Another thing that the Fiscal Control Board made quite clear in its communications with the governor, which are all published online, by the way, I have them for you in the show notes. But the Fiscal Control Board also wants public-private partnerships, or P3s, for infrastructure, which is also something we're hearing being bandied about by Congress here on the mainland. So this isn't just a Puerto Rico thing. But what the governor has already done is expedited permits via some executive orders. And then it also allows pension funds to invest in these public-private partnerships. So yeah, they're still playing with making bets with the pension fund money. But when it comes to energy reform, I've been kind of fascinated with this aspect of it since reading the Pro-Mesa bill, because privatization of Puerto Rico's energy was in the Pro-Mesa bill. So that's a congressional priority. And I wanted to know why. This isn't just the Fiscal Control Board. And so I did some digging on the situation in Puerto Rico. And so when it comes to their energy, I wanted to know, how expensive is it really? Because they keep saying that we need to privatize their energy because it's so expensive. Well, the national average for electricity is 10 cents per kilowatt hour. Puerto Rico's is double that. It's 20 cents per kilowatt hour. However, even though that's high, it's not the highest in the United States. That actually would be Hawaii's electricity, which is 25 cents per kilowatt hour. Puerto Rico's is also very close to Alaska's electricity rates, which is 19 cents per kilowatt hour, which I find very interesting considering Alaska is so like fossil fuel friendly and still they pay that much money for electricity. And even here in California, we pay 15 cents per kilowatt hour. So yes, Puerto Rico's electricity is expensive, but it's not like out of control. And when you think about the high rates in Puerto Rico, what could those be due to? Well, first of all, it's an island. Electricity on islands is quite expensive. And like I told you before, 67% of that electricity is generated using fossil fuels, which need to be brought to the island because there are none on Puerto Rico. And so since they have to import so much of their fossil fuels, the Jones Act comes into play because that means that all of the fossil fuels that are imported have to be on U.S. ships that are owned by U.S. companies and manned by U.S. citizens and all that nonsense, which just makes it more expensive and also doesn't allow Puerto Rico to get fossil fuels from other countries without paying ginormous fines and taxes and all of that. So that does contribute to the high rates. And then also Puerto Rico really hasn't invested that much in renewables. I mean, the max that they're even shooting for is 20%, like years and years down the line. And one of the things that I noticed while driving through Puerto Rico, considering my husband is a solar power engineer, is that when we were driving from San Juan, which is in the north, to Ponce, which was in the south, as we drove through the mountains, it was rainforest. It was beautiful and it was green. And then we came out to the other side of the mountains and it was dry. It was just, everything was brown. We actually did see a few windmills, but it's like designed for solar on that side of the island. It is a south-facing area that is so dry that all the plants are brown. And so that might be a solution for energy reform that might work better than private-public partnerships. But like I said, this is a priority of Congress. They put it in PROMESA. And so I really wanted to know why. And I think I found at least part of the answer. So there was a subcommittee of the House Natural Resources Committee that held an off C-SPAN hearing while I was on the plane returning from Puerto Rico on March 22nd. So naturally, I just had to watch this. And the reason I was so into this and I wanted to watch this before producing this episode is that the witnesses included the governor of Puerto Rico, that cutie pie, Ricardo Rossello, the chairman of the Fiscal Control Board, who is a banker and insurance broker named Jose Carrion III. There was another Fiscal Control Board member, Ana Montesantos. There was also the chairman of the board controlling PREPA. PREPA is the island's government-controlled electric utility. His name was Luis Benitez Hernandez. And then there was also a guy named Rob Bringlingson. Well, there was a guy named Rob, and he was the president and CEO of Accelerate, a Texas fossil fuel company.
One of these things is not like the others. Which one is different? Do you know?
And so naturally, I wanted to know why the CEO of the Texas fossil fuel company was testifying in a off C-SPAN hearing about Puerto Rico. And, well, here you go.
Accelerate is a Texas-based energy company, and we're engaged in the development of liquefied natural gas transportation and regasification infrastructure. We're a provider of LNG storage and regasification services and an importer of LNG. The company operates a fleet of 9 purpose-built floating storage and regasification units, or FSRUs as they're referred to, that are capable of regasifying LNG on board the vessel for delivery as gaseous natural gas to downstream customers around the world. In 2011, PREPA selected Accelerate for the development of a floating offshore LNG delivery system incorporating Accelerate's FSRU technology, a decision based on Accelerate's industry-leading expertise. Accelerate proposed an offshore delivery system with a capital cost of approximately $266 million, which includes infrastructure construction, permitting, and development costs. Annual operation and maintenance expenses are estimated to be approximately $6.2 million. In the spirit of partnership established with PREPA, Accelerate has constructed the FSRU, and the vessel stands ready to support the project.
So, a Texas company that coordinated a public-private partnership with the old Puerto Rican government already built their floating LNG boat, even though they didn't have all the needed permits for the incredibly stupid, short-sighted project that if construction ever happens, because it hasn't started yet, Puerto Rico will have a regasification plant floating a mile off of Puerto Rico's shore, connected via an underwater pipeline that will disrupt the habitats of turtles and other wildlife and tear up coral reefs that are already endangered. But let's take the wildlife out of this because the financial titans of the world don't seem to give a shit about them. So let's just talk about what they care about. Money. And what makes more sense for the island of Puerto Rico long term if there's going to be an investment in changing Puerto Rico's energy infrastructure? Does it make more sense to switch the energy infrastructure to run on gas, a substance that can be found naturally nowhere in Puerto Rico and therefore needs to be turned from gas into a liquid, shipped on U.S. ships to Puerto Rico, turned back into gas on a floating power plant, and then moved around in pipelines or tankers that can, explode all around the island? Or does it make more sense to switch to an energy infrastructure that is based on solar and wind, which are fuels that are available for free forever on this sunny and windy island? Now, of course, that's a rhetorical question. And so why is Congress and the Fiscal Control Board moving forward with that stupid plan to do the natural gas on boats thing? Well, this Texas company, Accelerate, they spent $210,000 lobbying Congress, including 2 lobbyists and $50,000 for PROMESA specifically. And what they got from that was energy reform included in the bill and created by this dictatorial board. Now, this broke island of Puerto Rico is being pressured to expedite the permits for public-private partnerships like this one, and the CEO of this Texas company is being invited to testify at the same hearing as Puerto Rico's governor, and he sat between members of the Fiscal Control Board during his testimony. Honestly, guys, this is what corruption looks like. And this is yet another way that what is happening to Puerto Rico mirrors what is happening to us all, but just on a more extreme level. Because fossil fuels have such a stranglehold on our Congress that part of the plan to save the island includes getting them hooked on natural gas, which is a fossil fuel, one that burns methane, which heats the atmosphere even more effectively than carbon dioxide does. But Congress is hooked on that fossil fuel industry cash, so much so that long-term consequences of this decision are just going to be ignored. Just like how the rest of us on the mainland were told that natural gas, which by the way is a propagandistic term to begin with because natural makes it sound green, even though it's a fossil fuel. And we should probably call it something else, something like, maybe methane gas. Done. Let's call it methane gas. Well, methane gas was pushed on all of us as a bridge fuel. And now we have more and more of our infrastructure dedicated to it, making our transition to free fuel, solar and wind, that much harder. We're all being played by the same game. But yeah, there's our explanation for that privatization of the energy grid clause in PROMESA. And so, what is going on with the Fiscal Control Board now? Well, one thing that I went to Puerto Rico to find out is whether Puerto Ricans are asking that question and paying attention, or are they like mainland Americans who generally have no idea what is being done with their tax money? And the answer is definitely yes. Puerto Ricans are well aware. I stayed in an embassy suites and they gave us local papers to read every morning. Every single morning, there were articles in the San Juan Star about the Fiscal Control Board. And it's a great paper. It's available online for free in English and Spanish. So if you want to keep tabs on what the board is doing in Puerto Rico, I put a link to the San Juan Star in the show notes for you. But every day, Puerto Ricans are reading about the Fiscal Control Board. And when I asked people about it, no one skipped a beat. They all had opinions. They knew exactly what was going on. And as of this recording, what is happening is that the governor submitted a plan and it was accepted. That happened this week, and so I didn't get a chance to read it. It was like 150 pages. But I think it's safe to assume that it incorporated the Fiscal Control Board's goals that I just outlined for you because the plan was accepted. However, I can tell you that the board added a couple things to the governor's plan. First, the board added a furlough program that's going to start sometime this summer. And what that means is that Puerto Rican government employees who work in the law enforcement branch of government are going to have 4 unpaid days off per month, although street police officers are exempted from that. And then teachers are going to have 2 unpaid days off per month. Also, there will be no Christmas bonuses for anybody. And the board is demanding that Puerto Rico sell its assets to pay for pension benefits. Yet another demand that will be great for the private sector freeloaders who will buy up Puerto Rican roads at a discount and put up tolls on them for 30 years. Or who will buy up Puerto Rican parks and charge admission. Or who will buy Puerto Rican parking meters and charge 4 times more. All of the types of things that we see happen when governments sell off the commons to the profiteers. And so that is how they're going to pay for the pension benefits that they basically gambled away. So basically the buzzword for all this is austerity. The people of Puerto Rico will pay, but what about the banks? Because a third of this debt is just interest payments to hedge funds who basically gave previous desperate Puerto Rican governments loan sharky type terms, and they're expecting to get every dollar of that interest. Well, so far, the Fiscal Control Board has only been focusing on how to, get money from the Puerto Rican people, and there have been no negotiations with the bank. But there is a deadline for that, and that's going to be May 1st. And so basically, we're going to have to wait and see if the banks are going to be told that they lose on making bad investments. But I'm not holding my breath. Because when do the banks ever lose in the so-called free market? Because I've never seen it in my lifetime, and they certainly have a history of winning in Puerto Rico. And so finally, what can and should we do about this? Well, first of all, we should all acknowledge that if you're hearing these words right now, you're aware of the situation. You can't put that genie back in the bottle. And so step one is to give a Pay attention now that you know that Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens and they are and have been treated unfairly for 100 years. And then step two is to listen to them. Because I can't speak for Puerto Ricans. I've been there once and I'm a wealthy white chick from Orange County, California. What happens next shouldn't be my call, and it's tragically unfair that it is. But I'm going to take my direction from Puerto Rican residents by listening when they speak. And so here's what Luis said about the way forward.
What would you like to see happen on the island? What do you think could help?
Becoming a state.
So that's the goal.
Yes, without a shadow of a doubt. Because if we become a state, we are able now to have a congressional delegation, 2 senators, and we're able to fight for equal funding so that the state does not need to subsidize such huge percentages. And now we have an equal playing field. Now if I get in debt, go ahead and criticize me all you want.
Well, and you have bankruptcy protection if you go into debt.
Also.
So there's one vote for statehood, although unofficial. But the entire island of Puerto Rico has already cast votes on the issue of statehood. They did so in 1967, 1991, 1993, 1998, and the last one in 2012. And in that latest election, just 5 years ago, 61.2% chose statehood. A clear majority of Puerto Ricans said they want to be a state. And they'll be speaking to us again on June 11th because they're having yet another vote to voice their opinions on the issue of statehood. And this time I'll be listening, and I hope you will too. Because the unfairness of it all is that only Congress can officially change Puerto Rico's status, and us first-class U.S. citizens are the only ones that can control Congress. And so Puerto Rico's future, for better or worse, is in our hands. And I, for one, would like to make it better and grant them statehood if that's what they choose. And what will that mean for us? Well, we'd have 102 senators instead of 100 and approximately 440 representatives in the House. Okay. And what would that mean for Puerto Rico? Well, citizens in Puerto Rico would be treated just as the rest of us by Congress, but no worse, which would be an improvement. Because Luis nailed the heart of the situation.
I'm a proud American, and I will defend our country wherever I go. Mm-hmm. But I'm also a realist. I cannot expect Congress to give the people in Puerto Rico a fair share of the pie when we don't have a delegation sitting at the table when the pie is divided.
And Puerto Ricans should be at the table. They are U.S. citizens. We are Puerto Ricans, and Puerto Ricans are us. But looking at the reality of the 115th Congress, if Puerto Ricans want statehood, that's going to have to be a sustained effort over the next few years because let's be real here, the federal government is currently 100% controlled by the Republican Party, and the president is Donald Trump, who seems to have some deep-seated childhood trauma inflicted upon him by Spanish-speaking people because he sure is hell-bent on getting as many of them out of the country as possible. And so to admit Puerto Rico into the Union, well, we have our work cut out for us. This is a long-term goal. But more immediately, something can be accomplished in a Republican government, and that's that you can call your congressman and tell them that the Jones Act, the one that requires every product that arrives or leaves Puerto Rico to be on a U.S. corporate-owned ship or else heavy fines are paid, well, you can tell them that the Jones Act has got to go. The Jones Act is nothing but a corporate favor, and even Republican congressmen who believe in the free market can be called out on that, because that's as rigged a market as it gets. And then last, something you can and should do is plan your next vacation in Puerto Rico. Tourism is a huge industry in Puerto Rico, and spending your money there can only help. But the thing is that you would get so much out of it. Because first of all, the weather is perfect. It's like 80 degrees there year round, and the ocean water was clean and warm. And when it is stormy there, it's like real storms, which, is always fun. The food was so good. They have this mashed banana stuff, mofongo. I guess it's like plantains, but like I know that a plantain is a banana. And all kinds of dishes are made with it, and it was delicious. And I hate bananas. I won't even let Joe eat them in the same room as me because I can't handle the smell. And as for like the ease of getting by, Spanish does seem like it's the main language, but damn near everyone spoke English. And even though Puerto Rico sounds like a foreign country, which I know is scary to some Americans who have never left, but Puerto Rico, it's not as foreign as you think. Sam's Club. Here we go.
Oh, we're in America.
Yeah. Famous Dave's, Wendy's, Walgreens, Popeyes, Pacific Sun, Nike, GNC, Nautica, Burlington Coat Factory. That's really needed here. There's Sprint.
And AT&T.
Oh, there was a Marshall's over there.
USPS.
Pay less.
Porta Potty.
Nope.
There's a Walgreens coming up. Oh my God.
Walgreens. There's another Walgreens.
Another Walgreens.
McDonald's.
Wendy's. Churches.
The churches.
KFC. Yeah,
In between the McDonald's and the KFC, you're going to make a left. We're going to make a left up here after Burger King.
Burger King.
Burger King.
Burger King.
Burger King. Everything you're used to having in the States is available in Puerto Rico. And then to buy things, you use the dollar. It's the same currency you use here, and the prices for things that, tourists buy, so the hotels, the food, the beer, they were totally reasonable. In fact, there's a local Puerto Rican beer that I loved called Medalla, and we were able to get it for $1.68 at the beach. I can get hammered in Puerto Rico for the price of 2 San Francisco beers. And there's actually more, freedom on the island than in most states because you can get your beers and cocktails to go from just about anywhere. It actually kind of threw me off because I went and ordered a margarita and the guy was like, "Do you want this to go?" And I was like, "Is this like entrapment?" It took a few days to get used to. But in Puerto Rico, adults are treated like adults and you can drink on the beach or while just walking down the street. And speaking of the beach, there were countless of adorable little open-air bars and restaurants with phenomenal views all over the island, which is one of the reasons I've already told Joe that I want to go back and soon, and we're bringing the dog, because everyone who knows me, personally at least, knows that hanging out outdoors, drinking beers in perfect warm weather is my happy place. And Puerto Rico is literally designed to be my happy place. And getting around was surprisingly easy, although Ryan and I did have to rent a car because public transportation is basically non-existent. But Uber is there now, and if you do rent a car, driving on the roads was just like here in the States. Although not exactly just like here in the States, the lack of government services is obvious right now on the roads.
I've never seen so many broken down cars on the side of the road. Like in my entire life, anywhere I've ever been.
Yeah, there are a lot.
But like these potholes, this is like what it's like every spring in Massachusetts, and they're fixed by like July.
Is this person drunk? Get on your side of the road, asshole. No wonder it looks like people are driving off the road. They're probably just avoiding potholes.
And no wonder they all have flat tires.
Oh, good point. Well, their tolls work perfectly.
Yeah, from a New York-based company.
Yeah, of course. And we did notice when we were on the main roads, because Ryan and I actually went off the beaten path for most of our time, but to go through the middle of the island from San Juan to Ponce, we did take the main roads. And when we were on those, there were a lot of tolls. But we rented from Thrifty, and I don't know if this is just a Thrifty thing, but for $5 a day, we got to just go through all the tolls. So I don't know if that's some kind of tourist perk or if the tolls are just that cheap, but that certainly didn't break the bank. So don't let the tolls stop you from going. And as long as you watch for the giant holes in the ground, the signage was essentially the same. I mean, I didn't have any trouble and I don't speak Spanish. And then the rules on the road were the same. It's not like they drive on a different side of the road. It was normal. And I actually get pretty massive anxiety in cars. And yeah, I was perfectly fine. And then there's the wildlife, some of which is used for transportation. And to tell you the truth, the animals we encountered were some of my favorite things about our adventure. That's a horse on the side of the freeway.
Oh my God. It's like a burrow. Is it? Hold on. It's real, right? Hold on.
Yes, it's real.
What is this horse?
Oh my God. This is happening. That's not a tourist.
Like, how
He is dead serious.
How does that not? Oh,
There's another one.
How do they not need helmets, but like a bike does?
I don't know. Oh my God, Zika's still in the car.
I know.
Chickens. A lot of chickens.
Rotisserie.
I like that the cows here look like they have nice lives. We just saw a dog walking down the street with what we think was a foot.
A foot. Like we don't think, we know.
Like what kind of foot? I don't know. Oh my God. Oh, puppy! What's happening?
He's just barking. Just go.
At us?
Yeah.
Am I gonna kill this dog?
No, just go.
Where is it?
Oh, look, it's so pretty.
It's chasing me.
Just go.
It's chasing me.
Just,
What is happening?
I think go that way.
Okay. I've never seen a dog chase a car like that before.
It had a collar on too, so it wasn't like a feral one.
Yeah, it was like someone's dog who was just being a dick. We also saw a bunch of iguanas, most of them dead after committing suicide by freeway. But, you know, they were there. I saw two that were alive. There was one on the side of the road who was about to kill himself. And then there was another one that was chilling a little bit further off. I think he was contemplating it, but I was the only one that saw them alive. Ryan just saw the dead ones. But then there were also little tiny frogs that you could hear all over the place at night chirping. They sounded like birds, and they were even inside our hotel. I found this out because you know how Embassy Suites, they put like foliage in their center courtyards? Well, at night, the courtyard had bird sounds, and it was cute until I wanted to sleep, and then it was annoying. And so I actually called down to the front desk to find out why on earth they would pump in bird sounds. And I found out that they were not birds, that they were real, and that they were frogs. And it turns out they were teeny tiny frogs that the staff couldn't find if they wanted to. In fact, the waiter in the courtyard bar said that he had worked there for years and still hadn't seen one. And so I want to find one. It's now on my bucket list. But the bottom line is that I loved Puerto Rico, and I think you will too. And if you're planning a vacation anyway to an island, I mean, especially if you're on the East Coast, it was only, I think, like an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours from Florida. But it's super easy to get to, and Southwest goes there now. So yeah, give Puerto Rico a hand by giving yourself an island vacation. It's one of like the easiest do-gooder actions you could possibly take. But yeah, I love Puerto Rico, and to anyone who is listening to this on the island, thank you for your hospitality. I will be back, and I'm not going to forget about you. So you already heard that this episode scared me, and it's led to some existential soul searching about even doing this podcast. I mean, I started this because I wanted to draw attention to Congress, and as I've kept going through Congress, the bigger picture of what is going on in the world is becoming clearer to me. Because it seems like every rabbit hole I go down seems to lead to a story of greed, of corporate power, of business letting nothing and no one stand in their way of profiting as much as they desire. Any efforts to resist it are squashed. In this episode, it showed me that my government is willing to squash its own people, and it doesn't matter if we're not doing anything wrong. And I know that I'm not doing anything wrong. In fact, I think caring about the world and our role in it and trying to, in whatever way I can, stop the bad things that we're doing, I think that's a good thing to do. But if I'm really good at this, I won't be under the DC radar forever. I'm gonna piss somebody off if I haven't already, someone vindictive with money and power. Now, obviously, I have the option to not do this anymore. It's like the abstinence method of not getting pregnant, but what's the fun in that? Because I love Congressional Dish. I love the episodes, and I love the people I've met and haven't met yet, who'd I'd never get to meet if I didn't do this show. And honestly, I love the money because this is a listener-supported podcast, and it's really close to fully supporting itself and me. And when I think about quitting, you know, the money has actually morphed from a problem with this job, as in for a long time it wasn't making me any, and now it's morphed into a reason to keep doing it. But Puerto Rico gave me a more heightened sense of awareness that I might be on the list of people who should be disappeared if we let our government get that out of control. Maybe I've just seen V for Vendetta too many times, but I think that one of the things that I need to do, that I need your help with, is to get this podcast big enough to where it actually gets people to vote out Congress. We need people who will restore the Constitution, who will protect my right to do this, not to chip away at it because they're terrified of terrorists, which, that's just a scary word for people. We need to have people in Congress that will fight corporate power, because government is the only thing powerful enough to actually do so. And corporations, well, they're the legal embodiment of greed. They exist only for money, which is why they do so much damage to their workers, to the environment, to customers, if they're allowed to do whatever they want in the pursuit of more and more cash. And at this point, I know that I want to keep doing Congressional Dish, but for my own personal safety, I feel like it has to make a real difference, and sooner rather than later. I need a better Congress. And if you think about your own life, your own health, look at how Congress is trying to help the insurance industry profit by allowing them to sell you plans that don't cover anything. If you think about your own safety, think about how the fact that Congress is allowing Donald Trump to escalate illegal wars in 7 countries. I tweeted an article this morning, I think it was New York Times, that went down a list of all of the horrific civilian deaths that we have caused in the last few months, including 60 dead people who were just in a mosque, 20 dead people who were in a school. You don't think that's going to make people want to kill us? You don't think that that's making us less safe? Also, if you think about your own paychecks, if you're one of these people that just cares about money, when prices rise for everything every January 1st and then sometimes randomly mid-year, does your paycheck rise too? Should companies be allowed to keep charging us more and more for the same or even inferior services? When you think about your kids, do you want them not to clean up this mess? Or should we maybe start it? All of us need a better Congress. And if this podcast doesn't in any way lead us there, then what the hell am I doing this for? And so even though the podcast needs your money, because unlike the advertising model, which serves corporations, Congressional Dish operates on value for value, as in you pay for what you think is fair for the value you receive from it, which is probably more than nothing. And you can contribute using Patreon, PayPal, or by having your bank send checks to the P.O. Box address, which is all of this is listed on the support page on congressionaldish.com. But even though this podcast needs your money, the goal of this is to change things. We can't keep being the bad guys in the world, doing corporate bidding and hurting people and expecting to get away with it. And so what I'm asking you for today is help. Please help spread the word about this podcast. Please get your friends and family to listen to it. Share your favorite episodes on social media. That's easy to do. You can even download the free Congressional Dish app onto people's phones. And that's especially effective with the older generation who don't understand podcast apps or what to do with them. You could plan a long road trip for this summer and pick out a juicy episode to get your captive audience hooked. And I can also use your help with getting on other shows to talk about Congress, because I'm pretty good at selling this myself, but doing it person by person doesn't really work. It helps to talk about the podcast in front of other people's audiences. And so I need your help with that, because I get suggestions all the time like, hey, you should be on Rubin Report, or you should be on the Young Turks, or you should be on Joe Rogan. And the problem with that is that I don't know those guys. I have to be invited to their party and they don't know who I am. So help me with the introductions. Don't tell me that I should go on these shows. I'm totally willing to do that. Tell them to invite me and give them a reason, share an episode, tell them what they'll hear in it, tell them why they should listen, tell them why you like it. Because I know that I respond to what my listeners tell me, and I'm sure that they do too. But we need this information out there, man. We need people to know what's going on in their branch in Congress. We need to know the details. We need the deep dive, because the TV is definitely letting us down. I turn on the TV in my hotel rooms or in the airports and it's all about Russia and Trump's golfing trips, while real people are being affected by actual laws that are being crafted. I mean, have you heard one word about Puerto Rico's Fiscal Control Board on the news? Did you know that people are being furloughed and that the island's assets are being sold off? Don't you think you should? So yeah, please help me get some focus onto the things that aren't clickbait. Help me get some people paying attention to what's actually happening in Congress, not these bullshit investigations. Because if that doesn't happen, there's no point to this at all. That said, I know some of you are helping the podcast, both in sharing it. So thank you for those of you who are already sharing the podcast, and then also the people who are contributing. And I'm going to get to the thank yous in just a second, but I did want to give you guys a little bit of a follow-up on the last episode, because in the last episode, we did a deep dive on repeal and replace. And there was some confusion there because that was the original version. But as these bills move, they do change. And so that's what was happening. They were changing the repeal and replace bill that I read for you. And so there were some amendments. As far as I know, not much was taken out, but they were trying to put things in. And so the repeal and replace bill, for those of you who don't know, it died in the House of Representatives. It never even got a vote, which was so fun to watch because like a half an hour before they were supposed to vote, it was like, oh, whoopsie, like we can't pass it. We don't have enough Republican votes, even though we control the entire House of Representatives. And the reason that they didn't have enough votes is there's a group of people. They're basically the Tea Party, but they call themselves the Freedom Caucus. And the Freedom Caucus wanted to make that horrible bill even worse. And what was crazy about it is what they wanted was to allow the insurance companies to sell any kind of plan. So right now we have an essential benefits package. So if the insurance companies are going to offer you health insurance on the exchanges, there's a list of things that they have to cover that seem pretty damn basic to me. Stuff like ambulances and hospital stays and emergencies and yes, maternity, because, you know, that's how babies are born. Every one of us was a baby at some point. But it's a list of things, preventative care, prescription drugs. It's a list of things that every plan has to cover just by like its nature of being a plan. And the Freedom Caucus wanted that to disappear. And what made me a little bit insane is that I read the bill and the essential benefits package in 2020 was disappearing for everyone on Medicaid and everyone on the exchange, which is damn near everyone. And so even the fact that that battle was taking place, and as I was reading all the articles, it was clear that people had not read the bill because they would have known that so much of the essential benefits package was already being taken away in the original bill. But the Freedom Caucus just wanted to make sure that it was faster, that happened sooner, and for absolutely everybody. And that way the insurance companies could take away the essential benefits for all plans, including the ones you get through your employer and just about anywhere. So so that's what actually tanked the bill. It wasn't like the reaction that I had to it was the same that happened in Congress and they did the right thing and stopped it. It's like, no, there was a group of Republicans in the House that wanted it to be worse. I mean, God, how is this real life? But where we stand right now, the bill's not officially dead. I mean, it's not like they pulled it completely. It still exists in the House of Representatives. They can still do a last minute vote when no one is there. I mean, these options are still there. So for people to report that it's officially dead and this battle is over, that's not true at all. We still need to pay attention to this because I don't think this is over. There's still a year and a half left of this Congress. But for right now, that has stopped moving. But keeping in mind that maybe it's just taking a water break and it can keep going towards the finish line. So don't let your guard down on that. And keep watching the news. And then if anything happens, of course, I'll let you know. Yeah. And then there have been some things signed into law. And so I think that's what I'm going to do with the next episode. Because I know that this episode was a few days late. And thank you for allowing me to do that. Like I said, when I was on the plane on the way back, there was a hearing with the governor of Puerto Rico. So I had to watch that. And then also a lot of the stuff I told you today just didn't seem real. So I took some extra time to really fact check this and look in the FBI files and just see for myself, can I say that these things happened? And I can. So yeah, I took the extra days to fact check this, and the show notes are monsters. So use that if you want to do the fact checking yourself, because I know a lot of this is like, how have I never heard about this? So yeah, that's what I use the extra few days for. But this next episode is going to be a quick turnaround. So what I'll do is I'll read the laws. We're basically through the first quarter of this year. And so I'll let you know what's been signed into law so far. And that'll be the next episode. But for this episode, I do want to thank the people that have made this possible. And like I told you before, February was a really bad month. We ended up breaking even, but March was much better. So thank you very much for that. I am always nervous that I don't know why I have to cry in order for people to step up and contribute, but I'm not going to cry today. So I do hope that people will still contribute in April, even though I'm not in tears. But yeah, the people that did step up in March, it was amazing. So thank you so much for helping out the podcast and helping me keep this going, especially with the crazy feelings that I've been having lately with the whole, why am I doing this? Are they going to put me in a black bag? So it's then I look at my bank account and it's like, well, I am making money from it at least. So at least there's that. Yeah. But before I get into thanking the specific people, I did get a note from one of our subscribers. Her name is Heather. And she had some information for us that I think you guys might like to hear. So here's her note. She said, "Hey, Jen, I just finished listening to episode 146. As always, you rock. You mentioned a listener asking about state level podcasts similar to your own. I have recently discovered a couple in my state of Missouri. There is a podcast called State House Blend. The host interviews a state representative on each episode over coffee and donuts. I am still stuck in the past episodes on this one, but one from August of 2016 features a female Republican state representative who was muscled out of the House through sexism, billionaire donors, and general bullying because she occasionally bucked the party line. I was aghast at her story. State House Blend also has a Kansas podcast, and I think the two used to be combined. I've also discovered a podcast called Heads Up Missouri, hosted by 5 female Democratic state senators and representatives. They discuss legislation working its way through the state legislature and their own experiences in office. The bullying they have described from our new governor is terrifying, but he's a miniature Trump, so I'm not surprised. Things are a little scary for me in Missouri right now. I really hope more states have podcasts like these to help people understand what is going on at a more local level. I thought you'd like to know, share with others, and if you ever get time, haha, check them out. Seriously, the Sheila's Salon episode on State House Blend is an eye-opener. Thank you so much for your amazing podcast. I love your rants. The award is well earned. Happy early birthday. Mine is the 24th. Heather. Heather, thank you for that information. I'm sure the people that listen to this from the state of Missouri would like to check out this podcast. And happy birthday. As for my birthday, and that's the other thing too, I did give myself the weekend off for my birthday in between Puerto Rico and releasing this episode, because if I was going to release it as I usually do on Sundays, I would have had to work straight through my birthday weekend. So thank you also for giving me my 35th birthday off. And I spent it with Joe. We went to a little area called Alameda. It's an island basically in between Oakland and San Francisco. And we're looking at moving there later this summer because one of the things what we want to do is have Joe work from home more often. But where I'm working in our living room in this one bedroom, it's really difficult, we've discovered. And so he worked from home Monday and Tuesday, so I couldn't start recording this till Wednesday because we're both working in the living room. So that's just not a dynamic that's working. And so we realized that we need a 2-bedroom. And because Congressional Dish is actually bringing in some money now, we looked at our finances and it'll be close, but I do think that we can afford it in a couple of months. And so we figured, since we have to pack up all our crap anyway, maybe we will try out a new neighborhood. And so we're looking at Alameda because it's right on the bay. And I don't know if I told you guys this before, but I own 2 paddle boards. I picked up the habit in Hawaii, and it's basically stand-up canoeing or kayaking. Like, I don't know. You stand on a board and you have a long paddle and you go. And I don't really like the waves. And so bay paddleboarding is perfect for me. I'm kind of like a cross-country paddleboarder. But Alameda has a really long beach and a marina, and it's perfect for paddleboarding, and I really miss it. And so that will also bring that back into my life, and I won't need a gym membership. So I actually have a gym membership now. I've had it, but I haven't been there in a year and a half. So yeah, I'm just like burning money until that runs out. So yeah, that is why we're in Alameda. We found an amazing brunch place. It's called the 1400 Bar and Grill, and they had bottomless mimosas for $10. So I was all over that. And then what's kind of funny is we got a hotel down there because it's not really close to where we live. So we got a hotel and we were walking back to pick up our car, and our friends the next morning were like, "Hey, are you guys still at brunch? We want to come by." And we were like, that was yesterday, stupids. But since I love that place, we met them there anyway. And 7 hours later, on my actual birthday, we were still there. And so it was really great because I got 2 days with amazing friends. The first day, like I said, we went to brunch. Then we hung out in a dog park and with Abby. And then my friends Mel, Dustin, and Freddie, they met us throughout the day. And it was a really fun day. And then on my actual birthday, hung out with Alex and Stacy. And that was such a great day and so much good food and lots of mimosas. And yeah, so it was a really great birthday with people that I just adore and no work, which was pretty nice. So yeah, so that is why your episode is late, and thank you for putting up with that. Basically with Congressional Dish, like I'm aiming for the second and fourth Sundays, but basically what I'm promising is 2 episodes a month. So sometimes you're just going to have to deal with me needing more time, and actually everyone was really cool about it. So thanks for that too. Speaking of thank yous, let's start with the new Patreon subscribers. Patreon is one where you can contribute per episode. And we have 2 people now that are contributing $35 per episode, which is beautiful. That is Corbin Hart and Mark Schnoblin. Mark Schnoblin. No, Mark Schnoblin. I don't know, Mark. I'm really sorry. Like, I feel really bad that you guys contribute to my podcast and I can't say your damn names. But Mark and Corbin, thank you so much for contributing $35 per episode. Edwin Vargas is also contributing $15 per episode. Thank you. Mike and Sarah Rich were contributing $5 an episode and they gave us a raise. Now they're contributing $10. So thank you very much. Also, Flat Earth Creationist is now contributing $7.50 per episode. This is a raise from $5. And thank you for that. We are now getting $6 an episode from Anthony Angelozzi. Thank you, Anthony. And good old Rachel Passer. She's an old friend of the podcast, and she is giving us a raise. She said, just want to let you know that if you see another PayPal cancellation, not to worry. I switched from $5.50 a month via PayPal to $5 an episode on Patreon. Hopefully that will get you a little closer to the $1,000 per episode on there and help you get some more deserved exposure. Cheers. Hope you enjoyed Puerto Rico. Rachel, thank you very much. And I just checked Patreon. We're at $970 per episode. So we're $30 away from that $1,000. And the reason that I picked the $1,000 is that is the number that covers the costs. So if we get $1,000 per episode, then the podcast in general can break even. I mean, obviously when I'm doing stuff like trips to Puerto Rico or podcast conventions, that's a little tougher, but just the bare bones of all of the people that I'm paying to help me with it and the hosting and all that, that's $1,000. We'll cover all of it. And we're getting real close on Patreon. So thank you for being a part of that. And we are also getting $5 an episode from Alexander Bellotta. And he is another person who switched over from PayPal. And he was actually one of the people that was one of the victims of the PayPal drop. And so he not only came back, but he came back onto Patreon. So thank you. We also are now getting $5 an episode from Adam Ray, and he says, I've only been listening to your invaluable program for a few months, but I just became a supporter on Patreon because I believe your work is essential in today's political quagmire. I am very middle of the road myself and hate the idea of aligning with any political party, so I appreciate your commitment to call out political shenanigans across the board. I've also recently had my own come to Jesus moment and accepted that if I want to see some positive change in the world, I need to put more into the game and support the people who do the kind of work that I believe should be done. So thank you for the amazing work you and your team do. You may be amused to note that I discovered your podcast while you were on a guest on the Seahawkers football podcast last year. You'd be shocked how many people I hear that from, actually. Hey, Brandon, by the way, Seahawkers podcast appearance was a big one. He continues, your wit and demeanor and my burgeoning sense of needing to be more knowledgeable about what's going on in the world compelled me to start listening, and I've been a podcast subscriber ever since. I suppose now I'm obligated to congratulate you and the Pats on yet another golf swing Super Bowl win this year. Hell yeah. Have you guys gotten bored of those yet? Never! Wishing you the best for 2017. Thank you, Adam. And of course, I'm excited about the Pats win. That was one of the best, one of the things I love so much about that win is that we had to really earn it in the fourth quarter. I mean, we had to do as if I'm on the team, but the Patriots had to do everything right. And they did. So yeah, this was actually my favorite Super Bowl win. So yes, not bored. And I hope we get another one this year. We're also getting $5 an episode from Regilio Martinez. Thank you, Regilio. And I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name. We also are getting an anonymous $5 an episode contribution from a person who said, hi, Jen, I just became a subscriber. Sorry it took so long. I love the show and it's become so important these days. It's wonderful to have a head start. Big thanks for the show notes on researching. I love being able to easily cite the bills at issue when writing to my congressman, Kevin Yoder. I wish you the best. Keep up the good work. I can't stand Kevin Yoder. I'm so glad you're in his district. So thank you. We're also getting $5 an episode from Dustin Junkert, who said, I just discovered your podcast in a somewhat embarrassing way from a visit you paid to the Seahawkers podcast, but I followed up and have become a loyal listener. I'm one of those people who has been completely bored by and uninterested in politics my entire life until the chaos of the Trump campaign. I was fascinated about how badly the Democrats played their cards and how atrociously the media covered everything. You caught me at a moment when I was intrigued by what was happening, yet I clearly couldn't trust any major media outlet. Congressional Dish has been extremely refreshing with your focus on Congress and the bills themselves, rather than just the president in a waterfall of rumors. Well put. Another plus is your clear-headed disgust with politicians on both sides of the aisle. You're transparent with your biases, you do a ton of research, and you have a knack for knowing how to attack a topic and discover the bottom line. Also, on your recommendation that I read Confessions of an Economic Hitman, swoon. Required reading for those who are interested in the kind of corruption your podcast regularly reveals. I'm happy to say that I'm finally at a place where I can give back a tiny bit of what you've given me. I know it's not much, but I hope that it at least helps to remind you that your work matters a lot, at least to this guy. Thanks. It does. Thank you so much for saying all those nice things. And for the contribution, of course. We're also getting $5 an episode from each of Bennett, Matt Armstrong, Valerie Blomberg, S. Grant, and Rachel Robinson. Thank you to you all. We're getting $3 an episode from Samuel Gelber. Thank you, Samuel. We're getting $2 an episode from JP Weingen. Thank you, JP. And $1 an episode from Alex Hargis. Thank you very much. Now on to the PayPal and paper check subscriptions. So we've had an issue with PayPal. It used to be that you could set your own contribution amount, but now there's a drop-down menu. So if you're subscribing on PayPal, I've given you a few options. Here's the thing about that. I am able to change those options. So if you want to set a new number, let me know and I'll change it because I have up to 10 and I might even be able to do a whole second button. I don't know. But if you wanted to do a bigger number or not even a bigger, but just a different number, let me know and I'll play with the button. It doesn't have to be that same thing. I just pulled those numbers out of my ass. So that's how the PayPal subscriptions work. You're setting ass numbers. And then with paper check subscriptions, honestly, those are my favorite because no one takes a cut. To be completely honest with you, Patreon takes a 10% cut, PayPal takes a 3% cut, and paper checks, there's no cut. It's just a deal between you and me. And so what you do is you can set it up with your bank's online banking. You pay Congressional Dish just like you would any other bill. And they send checks to the P.O. box, which you can find the address on the support page on congressionaldish.com. And so for subscriptions, these are the PayPal and paper check variety. Oh, and actually, this is an interesting tip. So this is from Daryl Taylor. He's a longtime subscriber. And he said, here's a note he sent in. He said, for the people having trouble setting up PayPal payments, if they go to the bottom of the screen and click desktop view, they will be able to set up their own amount of donation instead of the drop-down set amounts. So have not tested that yet. It might work. Guys, let me know if that works for you because then we don't have to screw around with this drop-down stuff. But that would be great. He also had the rest of a note, so I'll read it to you. He said, good luck following Rhino Care. F these pricks. I've had 6 years to come up with a plan. Paul Ryan needs firing. Don't they all, man? Of course, there will be plenty of changes, but when Ryan puts that on Trump's desk, keep up the great work and keep your dog off the grapes. LOL. Oh, speaking of my dog, let's see. Today, I'm recording the thank you portion on Thursday morning, so this was 36 hours ago. I don't even know what night that was, but 3:30 in the morning, the dog puked all over the house and we took her to the emergency room again. And this time there was no reason for it. So they just kind of gave her an injection of like stop puking medicine. And she seems okay. She's still tired, but geez, this dog has a weak stomach. So yeah, but at least that time it wasn't completely my fault like it was with the grapes. So I guess we're getting better at this whole doggy parenting thing. But yes, thank you for the tip, Daryl. Let's see. We have a new paper check subscription from John Vogel. This is $33.33 a month, and he's from Des Moines, Iowa. And he sent in a note. He said, in the morning, for a while, I've been debating whether or not to subscribe to the Wall Street Journal. Even though I value high-quality journalism, I hadn't pulled the trigger on a $400 a year subscription. I started listening to Congressional Dish with the James Mattis, Mike Pompeo episode, and I was blown away immediately. Congressional Dish is the gold standard in journalism as far as I'm concerned. Oh, thank you. If I was willing to invest $400 a year into journalism, I am more than willing to divert that fully into Congressional Dish. That comes out to about $33.33 per month, the magic number. And then here he says it's up to me if I want to play the jingle. And so what he's referring to is No Agenda. They have a jingle, but I always ask Adam before I, steal stuff from their podcast. And so because I'm just reading this now, I don't have that jingle. But yeah, so no jingle for you today. But yeah, cool that you have the magic number. Back to his note, he said, after the 2016 election, it's hard to find journalism I can still trust. I'm willing to pay Congressional Dish the Wall Street Journal sticker price to send a message. Thank you so much for doing that. Also, the Wall Street Journal is owned by the same people that own Fox News, which is worth knowing. I don't think that it's really affected their main stories, like the journalism part, but the op-ed section is just as right-wing as it gets. I mean, it's basically like turning on Fox News, except you're reading it. So yeah, that's another factor when it comes to the Wall Street Journal. But anyway, we are also getting $15 a month through PayPal from Dustin Harbour. Thank you very much. We're also now getting $10 a month. These are paper checks from Rod Edmonston of Studio City, California. And he also sent in an additional $240 in what he said was back payment. So here's his full note. He said, hey, Jen, my guilt has caught up to me. On March 10th, you should be receiving a new $10 a month subscription as well as $240 to cover 24 months of back payments. I've done it through bill pay, so you should get every penny. Sorry it took me so long to do the right thing. Specifically, thank you for the research on episode 145, healthcare. I'm one of those people who gets healthcare through my employer, and therefore I thought I was safe from all of this hullabaloo about the ACA. Sad to know I'm not out of the woods. If I could make a suggestion, I think you may need to soften your sales pitch regarding the value for value model. I do think that your content has value, but sometimes I feel like your message comes across as this information has value. I've given it to you, so now give me money because I deserve it, which seems a bit entitled. Almost as if you're demanding payment rather than asking for a contribution. Well, I'm assuming that it's not what you mean to say, but I think that's how it may be perceived. I mean, I don't think that I'm demanding payment, considering that I'm releasing this for free. I'm not. If I was demanding payment, then you couldn't get it for free. And then also asking people for money is the most awkward thing that I do. So I'm not great at it, and and yeah, I don't know how to do this. That's the thing when newbie podcasters ask me about the value for value model, like how does this work? And that's the thing when it comes to advertising, the actual performance of it on the podcast is so much easier with advertising because someone else tells you what to say. And with the value for value model, I have to explain it. I have to pitch it. I have to do it in a way that doesn't sound entitled, that walks that line, and it's awkward, and it's socially awkward is what it is. And that's the part of it that I really hate doing. So it doesn't feel great to know that I'm coming across, I don't even know. And I guess entitled is the word that it was labeled, but I'm doing the best I can, man. Back to his note, he said, instead, I suggest you find a way to succinctly and politely remind the listeners the value of your show. It could even be a pre-recorded bit that you play each episode. You know, I've thought about that, but the reason I don't do that is that that's easy to skip. And honestly, like, I think it's good for me to also remind myself of how the value for value model works. So, and plus, I don't know. I just don't like the idea of like pre-recording something that I drop in. Like that feels almost like an advertisement for Congressional Dish, if that makes any sense. I don't know. Anyway, he says, reiterate what you're providing and how you feel it makes a difference with examples of Congress responding to the people if possible. Shit, I wish I had some. Branding that it's really important. And I know marketing yourself feels slimy sometimes, but this could go a long way to convincing people to give you money. I guess. Oh, he said, just a thought, and sorry if I've caused any offense. Keep up the good work and hang in there. No, I'm not offended. I'm really hard to offend. So that's one thing. But I don't know, doesn't feel great. But I do understand you're contributing to the podcast, and that's what matters. And I appreciate you very much. So yeah, don't worry about a thing. We are cool, man. We're also now getting $10 a month. This is a check from Dan, and he also sent in an extra contribution of $190. Here is his note. He said, I've been listening since your appearance on Cara Santa Maria in June of 2015. By now, you should have received a check for $190, which equates to $10 a month since I started listening minus 1 month. I apparently miscounted the first time. You can expect to continue to receive $10 a month for the foreseeable future, assuming you continue the podcast or that my life doesn't end up in ruins. Or if my wife finds out. Oh boy. I don't know if it's good to like be sending some chick money without telling your wife. But back to his note, he said, your installment in April will make up the difference of my miscount. I wish I had the time to dedicate to learning all that you do on my own, but I just don't. The time and effort you put into it is greatly appreciated, and content is invaluable. If that weren't enough, I find your nonpartisan outlook refreshingly, especially now when most of what I see is blindly team-based and often hypocritical on both sides. Your opinions often don't align, but I always appreciate a different perspective. You may recall a respectful disagreement we had on Twitter regarding the Second Amendment. Not in particular, but I've had a few of those. So yeah, I don't know. You also didn't leave your Twitter handle, so that doesn't help me remember who you are. Back to his note, he said, this has been on my to-do list for quite some time. I'm happy to finally have checked it off. And if everyone listening did the same, you would still be underpaid. I hope the drop in donations is maybe just a tax season thing, and I hope this helps. Thanks again. It definitely does. Thank you very much. We're also getting $5.35 a month from Peter Weiler of Seattle, Washington. So thank you, Peter. We're also getting $5 a month from Keith Norman of San Jose, California. Thank you, neighbor. And he sent in a Twitter note. He said, I'm a new listener and new PayPal subscriber. CD144 and 145 were both excellent and eye-opening for me. Thank you for the work you do. You're very welcome. We're also getting $2.06 a month from Lily White Bracelet Company in Nedrow, New York. So thank you very much. And we're getting $2.06 a month from Morgan Hepmer of Tacoma, Washington. So thank you. And then 2 one-time contributions. And this first one I am very excited to tell you about. And I'm sure there's some podcasters listening to this that are excited to hear this too. But I did actually receive a $1,000 check from Ralph and Carolyn Rivera. And this is exciting for so many reasons. So first of all, I went to Podfest in Florida. And I remember I was talking to Ryan Gray and someone else. I don't know, but Ryan's a good friend of mine. And we were chatting and someone wanted to meet me, which is always weird for me because I still feel like, who am I? And it turned out it was Ralph Rivera. He was very excited to meet me and he's a big fan of Congressional Dish and his lovely wife, Carolyn, was there too. And so we got to chatting and they said that they would love to talk to me some more. So I invited them to dinner. And that night they came and had dinner with me and some of my friends. And it was great. Got to know them. And it turns out that we are similar souls because they had cats. And I don't know if you guys, some of you know this about me, some of you don't, but I've had pet rats for years and years and years. And in 2008, my pet rats died. And when they died, Joe and I, not just because they died, but it's okay, we have no pets anymore and we want some freedom. And so we sold everything we owned and we went to Europe. We got one-way tickets. We ended up in Hawaii. We did a cross-country road trip. We ended up in Boston. So, for a few years, we were just basically homeless and it was amazing. And I totally want to do it again. And so Ralph and Carolyn, they had cats and their cats passed away and the house felt sad. And so they sold their house and now they're essentially kind of homeless and doing the same thing. They're going from city to city and I'm so unbelievably jealous of them. So, finding this out, I was like, oh my God, I'm in love with you too. So I went on their podcast, which the name of it actually is escaping me right now, but they have a podcast of their own and they interviewed both me and my husband, Joe. So I'm excited to listen to that one. And when I get the file for that, I'll let you know. But they're also inventing something called the Podcaster's Toolbox, which is to help unorganized people like me get organized. It's like the back end thing. And we keep telling them they should release it and you should because it's ready. When that's ready, it'll be a good thing for podcasters. But yeah, so obviously I got to know these people while I was at Podfest. And at the end, and I really liked this about Podfest, kind of like how I spend the end of each of these shows thanking the people that make it possible. At Podfest, they did a thank you session and anyone can come onto the stage and say thank you for whatever they wanted. And Ralph got on the stage and he said, thank you for Congressional Dish. And he pledged to contribute $1,000. And right here on my desk is a $1,000 check from Ralph and Carolyn. So thank you very much, you guys. I know that is a huge contribution for you guys. And I appreciate you not only sharing the value financially, but I know that you've told people about the podcast. I've seen it on social media and you were just so kind to me. And I feel like I really made friends at Podfest. So yeah, thank you for now being a part of my life. And I can't wait to see you guys again, hopefully in August at Podcast Movement. So thank you so much. We also got a check for $300. Oh no, this was on PayPal. We got a PayPal for $379. This is from Bernstein Tax Services, LLC. So if you need your taxes done, there you go. And this is from a current subscriber. So this is a bonus. So thank you, Bernstein Tax Services. Oh, here's the note. It says, I was just listening to your podcast and was sad to hear that February was a bad month for you. You are the best in the biz and have been an inspiration to me. I hope things turn around for you. Well, you certainly helped that happen. So thank you. We also got a very fun contribution of 222.22, 222 and 22 cents from Mark Voorhees. Thank you very much, Mark. And he said, wow. Repeal and Replace was your best show yet. P.S. Wow. You are freaking out so I don't have to. And that is a valuable service. Yes, I was freaking out. And that bill's not dead. It's not really dead. So keep an eye out for it. We also got an anonymous $200 check. So thank you, Anonymous. You know who you are. We also got a $120 check from Jane and Neville Nason. And Neville Nason has been a supporter of this show before. They're from Redwood City, California. And the note on the check says, hi, Jen. So thank you very much, Neville. Nice to hear from you again. And then my good friend, Stephen McMahon, has stepped up again. He contributed $110. This time this is a check. And the thing about Stephen, he's also a subscriber at $50 a month. So Stephen has been so supportive of the podcast and of me. And here is his note. He said, Jen, congrats on the award for the rant. Social Security bill I was tracking seems to be dormant for now. So that's good. Sometimes we talk about bills via email. Still waiting on my Freedom of Information Act request. My online account has been locked due to inactivity. It seems like a catch-22 issue. We'll keep you updated. Hope all is well at your end, Stephen McMahon. All is pretty good. Actually, I'm really glad that this episode is done. Hopefully I can sleep a little better. And this was a big project. So I'm feeling great right now. As soon as I press stop on here, I'm going to be feeling real good. So we also got an anonymous $100 contribution. So thank you. You know who you are. We got a $100 check from Margot Cruz of Bronx, New York. And the note on the check says, "Thank you for your amazing work. You're very welcome." And we got a $50 check from Maria Tribblehorn, and she's from Oaktown because she's a good friend of mine. And actually, she handed me this check while she was giving me another check for a hotel room in Mexico. And I think we're up to like 26 people that are going on this adult spring break that I've put together. We're going for Cinco de Mayo, and more and more people keep signing up for this. And so I'm so excited. And, I fell in love with Maria. When I first met Maria, she was kind of quiet. And I don't really know what to do with quiet people because I'm obviously like not quiet at all. But Maria and I bonded because there was, and I know how ridiculous this is, but there was a NSYNC versus Backstreet Boys, like party dance off where basically it was like cheesy 90s music. It was at this club and we went, and I honestly, that was the most fun I had in 2016. That was hands down my favorite night. And I went with Maria and 2 other girlfriends of ours, and I just had so much fun. So I am so excited. Like our little group of 4, no, was there 5 of us? I think there were 5 of us. I know that at least 4 of us are going to be in Mexico together. So yeah, when all of like our cool friends walk out because the music is like too old and bad, like I know at least 4 of us will still be there. Oh, and by the way, in Backstreet Boys versus NSYNC, Backstreet Boys crushed it. And I didn't see that coming, but I knew like every Backstreet Boys song, and NSYNC, like I knew some of them. But yeah, Backstreet Boys won, and there was it wasn't even a competition really for me. So yeah, now you know I'm a giant nerd, and that Maria is too, and that she's my friend and she supports the podcast. So thanks, Maria. We also got an anonymous $50 check. Thank you. You know who you are. We got a $50 check from Philip Cole, who said, "Hi, Jen. I plan to give $10 a month. I've missed a few months, so this is to catch up a bit. Your work is so important, and the way you break down the bills and put them in context is very helpful. Thanks for all you do, and hopefully the support begins to match what you are providing, Phil." Thank you, Phil. We also got a $50 check from Jamie Blackwell of Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And she said that this is for 2015 and she'll start $5 a month in April. Awesome. So thank you for that too. We also got 3737 from Russell Hugo and Ann Huynh of Seattle, Washington. Thank you, Russell and Ann. We got a $50 check from Matthew Boehm of Springfield, Virginia. I don't think this is your first contribution, so thank you. Nice to see your name again. We got 3720 from Patrick Weingart, and that came in 2 separate donations, one for 2017 and one for 1703. And he sent in a note. He told me that James Mattis, who is our Secretary of Defense, his other nickname is Warrior Monk. Sorry, your donations have been lacking. Hope this helps. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Thank you. And he asked for a ruff, ruff, Mad Dog Mattis because he said it cracks him up. You guys are going to make me do that every time now, aren't you? But there you go. We also got a check for $26.87 from Abigail Soward of Estancia, New Mexico. And she said, "I hope your March is better." And it was. Thank you very much. We got an anonymous Bitcoin contribution of about $25. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, that's right. We take Bitcoin. I always forget about Bitcoin. We also got a $25 check from Eloisa Esperanza, and this is an extra contribution because she's already a Patreon subscriber. And here is her note. She said, "Dear Jen, I am sending along this extra contribution in hopes of helping to make up a little for your February. I want you to know that I really appreciate your efforts at steering clear at picking a side, and I love that you provide all your sources. It helps me call BS to other podcasts I have listened to recently. Listening to your podcast has gotten me more involved in contacting my representatives frequently. I am even running for my local school board because incumbents running unopposed is crap. That is awesome. Everything I've learned on your podcast has even helped me direct articles that I read in the paper and look out for those popular buzzwords. Free market, anyone? Keep up the good work and know that there are some of us who find your podcast to be an invaluable resource. Eloisa." Thank you. We also got a $25 check from John Collier of San Diego, California. He said, "A friend told me about your podcast, and thank God she did. I follow politics for the past 30 years. At 19 years old, I was stationed in West Germany in 1982. That's when I was born. The TV station AFN only had 3 stations. One was CNN. Friends have told me for years that I should run for office, but the only thing that stopped me was that I was too lazy to do the research." And he's smiling. "I love how you hold both parties to the mat. I love how you explain a topic in a way that a novice can understand. I love how you give backgrounds on your topic. Kind of reminds me of Rachel Maddow." And I actually take that as a compliment. I miss Rachel Maddow, the podcaster, but I like her style, and I like that she does deep dives on things. So I take that as a compliment. "I wish you were on weekly, and hopefully one day I will see you on TV or run for office. John Collier, San Diego, California." Thank you very much. And honestly, I don't want to be on TV because, I don't know, I'm a Weight Watcher. I don't know. People are so mean about how you look. And one of the things that I love about podcasting is that right now I'm sitting here looking like a garbage person and none of you know that. So, I can do my work with no pants on if I want to. And in the summer, I often do. So, so yeah, TV freaks me out because I have to actually like do my hair and like care what I look like. So, I mean, it's all vanity. That's the reason I don't want to do TV, but I really, really don't. And as for weekly, I mean, these episodes are pretty tough and I hoped that I could do weekly, but it was just killing me. So for now, twice a month is what you get. And I think that has to be enough because it's about all I can do at the moment. Let's see. We also got a $25 check from Krista Morrison of Lubbock, Texas. And she said, thank you so much for the effort you put into Congressional Dish. I love having a resource that provides quality information mixed with humor in an accessible format. I've listened to 3 or 4 episodes and I think you're doing a great thing. Whether I agree with you or not, you always provide quality information and passion, which in turn challenged me to think more about my own thoughts and opinions. You're amazing. Best, Krista. Thank you, Krista. We also got a $25 check from Sophia Garcia in Okinawa, Japan. And Sophia says, enjoyed CD144 and wanted to show my support listening from Okinawa, Japan. Thank you. And that's awesome. See, this is what I'm saying, guys. I know that the golf swing irritates some of you. And Japan isn't one of these countries, but there are countries that don't allow podcasts in the iTunes store that have profanity. And so I have to golf swing like the forbidden words, I mean, that is the main reason I do this. And here's proof. Like I said earlier, we have 182 countries that are tuning in the Congressional Dish. Why cut off the people that are in the most repressed ones like China and India? That just doesn't make sense to me. It's not worth it. So that's why I put the golf swing in. So here you go. Here's proof that we have people outside the United States that listen to this. And people who can vote are there too. We also got $25 from Jonathan Clapper. Thank you, Jonathan. We got a $25 check from Lisa Kluda, who said, hello, included is a check of $25 for you. So appreciate your podcast and how you share information that isn't particularly to the left or right. Keep up the great work. You're very welcome. And I like that you guys appreciate that I do that. It's hard sometimes, especially right now. This is tough because the Republicans are in control of the entire Congress. So, I mean, I know for the next year, I'm going to be accused of being partisan because of course I'm going to bash the Republicans. They're the only ones in charge. There's plenty of stupid going on with the Democrats, especially when it comes to this Russia shit. And, if this continues, I might have to do an episode just to point out how much nonsense it is. And although I don't even want to put that out there because I don't want to do that episode. You can hear it. I don't know. It's just, the Democrats are so ineffective. I can't stand it. I just try to look at things as they are. And because I'm not part of either party, it's pretty easy for me to just be like, nope, you're stupid and you're stupid and you're stupid. You're cool. You're stupid. Like, it's just kind of how I roll. We also have a $25 check from Judith and Jeffrey Petrusek from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And they said, this is a contribution for your valuable work. Well, thank you very much. We got a $25 check from Tom Barron of Arvada, Colorado. Thank you, Tom. We got a $20 PayPal contribution from John Tinsley, who said, have been digging through a lot of different politics podcasts recently and have found yours to be by far the most educational, in-depth, and also clearly communicated regarding what's actually going on. Keep up the great work. Thank you very much. We also got a $20 check from Nathan Churico of I know I'm butchering your name and I apologize, but Nathan of North Canton, Ohio, who said, the work you are putting into the podcast is real and immensely appreciated. On your last show, you spoke about financial issues. I thought that I could bump up the monthly since I received a new job and also a raise. Oh, thank you. Okay. I also thought that I was doing a monthly payment through Patreon, and to my surprise, I wasn't. Okay. I was just going to say, I don't see that, but I don't know if at one point I wanted to and just didn't, but either the case I am now, you'll be receiving a $20 monthly check on the 13th and a $50 one-time payment. Okay, so this is actually, I apologize, this should be in the subscriber category, but yeah, this is now a $20 per month subscription. So thank you very much, Nathan. Your podcast is a gift and I don't really want to see you go. I am one of the millions who have walked out of college with debt, but I am lucky that it's a manageable debt. I'm on the mission to be an informed citizen, and you are a key individual to help me along. Thank you so much for your continued effort in this journey creating the Congressional Dish. P.S. In the future, if you want to do user-created shows, put me down as a volunteer. I don't think I'm ready yet, but in a year's time, I think I could be. P.P.S. I'm also sending warm wishes and hugs to help you through this. Don't hurt your soul over this unless you want to be a martyr or something, LOL. The truth is that I don't. I really don't. I've thought about this, if it really hits the fan, am I going to keep going this and like die for my country? And the truth is like, no. This is one of the reasons why I appreciate people who are in the military, because they are willing to do that, where I don't think I am, and I don't think I'm that brave. And I think that's one of the reasons where even the thought of like having to be locked up in jail or whatever, penalties might come to me personally for doing this and messing with powerful people. I mean, I think that's why that scares me so much, because I'm not brave and I'm not one of the people that's willing to do that. I'm not a martyr. So yeah, I'll keep doing this until shit gets real, and then bye. But anyway, thank you, Nathan, for your new subscription. We also got a $20 check from Ryan Mays of Clinton, New York. Thank you, Ryan. We got an anonymous $20 check. Thank you, anonymous. We got a $15 PayPal contribution from Christine Lee. Thank you, Christine. We got a $10 check from Amy Danger of Cincinnati, Ohio. And I remember saying I love that name before, so thank you for your repeat contribution. We also got a $10 check from Edgar Decker III from Scottsdale, Arizona, who says, I enjoy the podcast. Thank you. You're very welcome. We got a $10 check from Daniel and William Orr of Ocean City, New Jersey. I like Ocean City. I've been there. We also got a $10 check from Matthew and Saba Seaver of Knoxville, Tennessee. Tennessee is stepping up today. I love it. Thank you, Matthew and Saba. We also got $10 from Freddie Hill. Thank you, Freddie. $10 from Emilio Perez. Oh, boy. Arujo. Thank you, Emilio. And Amelia says, hey, just subscribe to your podcast, and I'm glad there's someone to tell all these things to the American people. We're going to need it more than ever. Well, thank you very much. We got $10 from Jody Bussey. Thank you, Jody. $10 from Eric Brown of New Jersey. Thank you, Eric. And he says he loves the show notes on the site. Thank you. I'm glad you're using them. We also got 666 from Elise Hagen. And Elise says, I'm going to try and make this monthly, but I'm working in retail. Got to save for grad school somehow. And sometimes the money isn't there. Also, I'm glad somebody else caught the non-change in Section 14 on the American Health Care Act, which is repealed and replaced, because I thought it was weird. Elise, I'm so glad that you saw it too, because I think you're like the only person who went through the bill and saw the same thing I did. You're certainly the only person to contact me about it. So very cool. And here's the thing. I like that you did a contribution. Like, I get that finances go up and down. So contribute the months when you can and don't when you can't. Like, I get it. So Elise, thank you. We also got a $5 check from Hardil Campos Pedron. And he said, hi, Jennifer, where do I start? First of all, you are nothing but the supreme goddess of the Mother Earth, and don't even contemplate anything less. The reason I told you that is because a similar choice of words cheered up my daughter recently when she felt very distressed. I hope it worked for you. It did. I'm smiling pretty big right now. Now that I can stop pretending to be a father figure, I'll say I lost track of that a couple of years ago when you were on YouTube with Jesse Ventura. And I got curious about someone actually doing, let alone caring, about the monumental task you do. Since then, your podcast is a recurrent source when I need to cut through all the bullshit, smoke, and mirrors our elected officials resort to in order to profit from their job and avoid our accountability. So after listening to Congressional Dish 145, I am sorry to hear that you're struggling to stay on, so I decided to send you a small contribution. The fact that this is the first time I've ever done this doesn't make much difference to you, but it is a great deal to me since I have been unemployed for almost a year now. Wow. Please don't doubt for a second the uniqueness, multidimensional influence, and significance of your work, let alone its inherent value, especially in this time in our history when I see our country walking towards a darker path so familiar to me when I was growing up in Cuba back in the 60s. Don't give up just yet. Your country needs you more than ever. Thank you for that note. And I get that I really appreciate that you're willing to contribute even though you're unemployed. I know how hard budgeting is. So thank you. I really appreciate the encouragement, the note, and your contribution. We also got $5 from Diane Faffel. Thank you, Diane. We got a $5 check from Shelby Bautista of Seattle, Washington. Seattle's another city that's stepping up this week. I love it. We also got a $2 check from Deanna Conkling of Kalamazoo, Michigan. And I'd be curious to know if that river of yours is cleaned up yet from that Tars fan spill. But yeah, thank you, Deanna. And then we also, last but never least, we got a check from Bud Johnson. And he said that CD147 was great and that he is out of the hospital. And I'm so happy to hear that. So thank you, Bud. And yeah, that's it for today. So again, thank you all so much for contributing to Congressional Dish. And like I said, I'm going to read the new Trump laws for the next episode and we'll go from there. So thanks so much. And I will talk to you guys very soon because I'm not going to take a ton of time for this next one, because there really haven't been that many laws. That's really the good news here, is that the Republican infighting has really stopped them from doing a lot of the more consequential things that they had on their list. So, there's good news in having a really inept Congress sometimes. All right, signing off. Talk to you later. Bye.